Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe. Your support is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. I had always loved horror movies. So when I heard about the special screening of a newly restored version of a long-lost horror film from the 1970s, I jumped at the chance to attend. The movie, titled The Haunting of Blackwood Manor, was infamous for its troubled production and the mysterious disappearance of several cast members. The original reel had been lost for decades, only recently discovered in an old storage unit. The event promised a night of genuine scares and an atmosphere thick with nostalgia. The theater was packed with horror enthusiasts, the air buzzing with excitement and anticipation. The lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, the grainy footage giving the film an authentic, unsettling feel. As the opening credits rolled, a sense of foreboding settled over the audience. The movie's plot revolved around a family that moved into an old, isolated mansion, only to be tormented by malevolent spirits. It was a classic setup, but there was something about the film that felt different, darker, more sinister. About halfway through the movie, during a particularly tense scene, the screen suddenly went black. The audience murmured in confusion, thinking it was a technical glitch. The theater remained dark for several minutes, the only sound the uneasy whispers of the crowd. Then, without warning, the screen flickered back to life, but the footage was different. It showed grainy, distorted images of the theater itself, as if someone was filming us from inside the auditorium. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the camera was moving, panning across the rows of seats. The audience fell silent, the tension palpable. The camera zoomed in on a figure sitting in the back row, their face obscured by shadows. The figure stood up and began walking towards the screen, the camera following their every move. As they reached the front of the theater, the screen went black again. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the auditorium, and the lights flickered back on. People were looking around in panic, trying to locate the source of the scream. I turned to my friend, Lisa, who was sitting beside me, her face pale with fear. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my heart racing. Before we could make sense of what was happening, the screen lit up once more, showing the film again. The scene had changed, and now depicted the family in the movie being terrorized by an unseen force. The sound of footsteps echoed through the theater, matching the ones on screen. The synchronization was unnerving, making it feel like the events in the movie were bleeding into our reality. As the tension in the movie escalated, so did the atmosphere in the theater. People were on edge, some clutching their seats, others nervously glancing around. The air grew colder, and an oppressive sense of dread settled over us. Suddenly, the figure from the earlier footage appeared on screen again, but this time they were standing in front of the haunted manor's door. The figure turned slowly, their face still hidden, and pointed directly at the camera. The image cut to static, and the lights in the theater flickered once more. Panic began to spread, with several people getting up to leave. But as they reached the aisles, the doors at the back of the auditorium slammed shut, trapping us inside. The screen showed the figure entering the manor, and the sound of creaking floorboards filled the theater. The figure moved through the dark, empty halls, their footsteps echoing ominously. As they approached a closed door, the sound of heavy breathing filled the room. The door creaked open, revealing a shadowy room filled with old, decaying furniture. The camera moved into the room, focusing on a large, ornate mirror. The reflection showed not the room, but the inside of the theater, with the audience watching in horrified silence. The figure in the mirror raised their hand and placed it against the glass. At that moment, a cold gust of wind swept through the theater, extinguishing the lights once more. In the darkness, the sound of whispers filled the air, growing louder and more frantic. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I jumped, my heart pounding. Lisa grabbed my hand, her grip tight with fear. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice barely audible over the whispers. We stood up and made our way to the aisle, using the light from our phones to guide us. Others were doing the same, moving quickly towards the exits. But as we reached the doors, we found them locked, the handles cold and unyielding. The whispers grew louder, and a sense of panic set in. Suddenly, the screen lit up again, showing the figure standing in the middle of the haunted manor. They turned slowly, their face finally revealed a ghastly, twisted visage that seemed to stare directly at us. The figure raised their hand, and the screen went black once more. The whispers stopped, and the theater was plunged into an eerie silence. Then the sound of footsteps echoed through the auditorium, growing louder and closer. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread filled the room. The figure from the screen seemed to materialize out of the darkness, their ghastly face visible in the dim light. They moved slowly, deliberately down the aisle, their eyes fixed on the screen. People pressed themselves against the seats, trying to avoid the figure's gaze. As they reached the front of the theater, they turned to face us, their expression one of malevolent intent. The figure raised their hand, and the doors at the back of the theater flew open. A blinding light filled the room, and the figure vanished as quickly as they had appeared. People rushed towards the exits, desperate to escape the theater. Lisa and I joined the crowd, our hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. As we spilled out into the night, the cold air was a welcome relief. We stood on the sidewalk, catching our breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. The other patrons were equally shaken, exchanging bewildered glances and hushed conversations. Lisa and I decided to walk home, needing the fresh air to clear our heads. As we walked, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, and every sound set our nerves on edge. When we finally reached my apartment, we hurried inside, locking the door behind us. We spent the rest of the night talking about the experience, trying to rationalize what we had seen. But no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us home. The sense of unease lingered, and we found ourselves glancing over our shoulders, expecting to see the figure from the theater. In the days that followed, strange occurrences began to happen in my apartment. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker, and the temperature would drop inexplicably. Lisa and I grew more and more uneasy, our nerves frayed by the constant sense of being watched. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft whispering coming from the corner of the room. I sat up, my heart pounding, and saw a shadowy figure standing in the darkness. The figure moved closer, and I recognized the ghastly face from the theater. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, and the room grew cold, the air thick with fear. Just as the figure was about to touch me, I jolted awake, drenched in sweat. It had been a nightmare, but the sense of dread was all too real. I turned on the lights and sat up, trying to calm my racing heart. We spent the rest of the night in the living room, too scared to sleep. The next morning, we decided to contact Marcus, the paranormal investigator who had helped Cage. Marcus listened to our story with a calm, professional demeanor and agreed to visit my apartment. He arrived later that day, equipped with his usual array of tools. As Marcus conducted his investigation, He confirmed our suspicions the apartment was indeed haunted. He explained that the figure we had seen was likely a malevolent spirit, drawn to us by the events at the theater. He suggested a cleansing ritual to dispel the spirit and bring peace to our home. That evening, Marcus performed the ritual, burning sage and reciting prayers. The air grew tense, and the temperature dropped as the spirit made its presence known. But Marcus remained steadfast, commanding the spirit to leave. The room filled with a blinding light, and the oppressive weight lifted. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences ceased, and the sense of dread dissipated. Lisa and I finally felt at peace, our home no longer haunted by the malevolent presence. We continued to enjoy horror movies, but with a newfound respect for the power of the supernatural. The experience had been a harrowing reminder of the thin line between fiction and reality, and the forces that exist just beyond our understanding. It taught us to respect the stories we tell and the spirits that may linger in the shadows. The cursed film reel had been more than just a movie. It had been a gateway to the unknown, one that we would never forget. It was a rainy evening in New Orleans, the kind where the mist rolls in off the Mississippi River, wrapping the city in a shroud of mystery. I had been out late, exploring the French Quarter, soaking in the vibrant music and savoring the rich, spicy food. The streets, usually bustling with life, had grown quieter as the night deepened. I decided it was time to head back to my hotel, so I hailed a taxi near Jackson Square. The cab pulled up and I got in, grateful to be out of the rain. The driver was an older man, with deep lines etched into his face and a thick New Orleans accent. He wore a worn cap pulled low over his eyes, and a cigarette dangled from the corner of his mouth. "Where to?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I gave him the address of my hotel, a historic building not far from the Garden District. He nodded and pulled away from the curb, the wipers squeaking rhythmically as they fought against the downpour. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few stragglers and the occasional couple huddled under umbrellas. The city, usually so full of life, felt oddly desolate. As we drove through the narrow, winding streets, I noticed that the cab's interior felt strangely cold, almost as if the air conditioning was on full blast. But there was no hum of a fan. I shivered and pulled my jacket tighter around me. The driver was silent, his eyes focused on the road ahead. There was something about his demeanor that put me on edge. He didn't make any small talk, which was unusual for a New Orleans cabbie. Most drivers I had encountered were chatty, eager to share stories about the city's history, its culture, and its many legends, but this man said nothing. We passed through a particularly old part of the city, where the buildings leaned and close to the street, their wrought-iron balconies draped with Spanish moss. The rain had turned the cobblestones slick, and the street lights cast eerie, elongated shadows. I tried to make conversation, to break the unsettling silence. "New Orleans is beautiful, even in the rain," I said, hoping to elicit a response. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes dark and unreadable. "It's an old city," he replied curtly. Full of ghosts, his words sent a chill down my spine, and I regretted trying to start a conversation. I fell silent, staring out the window at the rain-soaked streets. After a while, I noticed something strange. The city outside seemed different, as if we had entered a part of New Orleans I didn't recognize. The buildings were older, more decrepit, and the street lights were dimmer, casting only faint pools of light. The air grew heavier, thick with humidity, and something else I couldn't quite place. I leaned forward, peering through the windshield. "Are we going the right way?" I asked, my voice tinged with unease. The driver didn't respond immediately. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and somber. "This city has many roads, some of which lead to places not meant for the living." His words hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. I felt my heart rate quicken, a growing sense of dread settling in my chest. I glanced at the meter, but it was dark, not ticking away as it should have been. Panic began to rise in me. "I think you've made a wrong turn." "This doesn't look like the way to my hotel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The driver looked at me through the rearview mirror again, his gaze piercing. "Sometimes the city chooses where you need to go." His cryptic response did nothing to calm my nerves. I tried to open the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been locked from the outside. My breathing grew rapid, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Let me out," I demanded, my voice trembling with fear. The driver didn't respond. Instead, he continued down the dark, unfamiliar streets, the rain pounding against the windows like a relentless drumbeat. The city outside the cab seemed to shift and change, becoming more and more unrecognizable. The buildings were older, more decayed, as if we had traveled back in time to a New Orleans long forgotten. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of nightmare, a hallucination? I had heard stories of the supernatural in New Orleans, but I had never believed in them until now. I tried to reason with the driver, pleading with him to let me out, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road. The cab seemed to move through the city with a will of its own, taking turns down streets that didn't exist on any map I knew of. Finally, the cab came to a stop in front of a grand, crumbling mansion, its windows dark and its gates rusted with age. The rain had stopped, and the silence was deafening. The driver turned to me, his expression grave. "This is where you get out," he said, his voice void of any emotion. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. "I don't want to get out here." "This isn't my hotel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The driver's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I saw something that made my blood run cold, a flicker of something inhuman, something ancient, lurking behind those eyes. "You were meant to come here," he said, his voice low and commanding. "This place has been waiting for you." I felt a pull, an almost magnetic force, urging me to step out of the cab. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open, then stepped onto the cracked pavement. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the house loomed before me like a dark sentinel. The cab door slammed shut behind me, and when I turned around, the taxi was gone. There was no sign of the driver, no tire tracks on the wet street, nothing. I was alone, standing in front of the dilapidated mansion. My heart pounded in my chest as I took in my surroundings. The mansion was surrounded by an overgrown garden, its wrought iron gates twisted and broken. The windows were shattered, and the front door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Despite every instinct telling me to run, I found myself walking toward the house, drawn by an invisible force. I pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something rotten. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the space. The house was a maze of decaying rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. As I moved through the mansion, I heard whispers, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from all around me. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. I could feel the presence of something or someone watching me. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, As I reached the grand staircase at the center of the house, I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to turn back, but my feet carried me forward, up the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the top, I could see my breath misting in the dim light. The whispers had become a chorus now, overlapping voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. At the end of the hallway, I saw a door slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. My heart raced as I approached the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty, save for an old mirror hanging on the far wall. The mirror was large and ornate, its frame tarnished with age. As I stared at it, I saw my reflection, but something was wrong. The reflection wasn't moving in sync with me. It was delayed, like a lagging video feed. And there was something in the background, just out of focus. I leaned in closer, trying to make out the figure in the mirror. It was a shadowy form, barely visible, but as I stared, it began to take shape. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing, a reflection of the cab driver standing right behind me, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I spun around, but the room was empty. My reflection, however, remained fixed on the spot, staring at me with a twisted smile. The mirror began to crack, spider webbing across the surface, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the mansion, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I didn't stop running until I was far from the house, the cold night air burning in my lungs. I finally slowed down, looking around to see where I was. The mansion was gone, and I was standing on a deserted street in New Orleans, the city's familiar sounds returning to my ears. I made my way back to my hotel, shaken and exhausted. The next morning, I tried to make sense of what had happened, but it all seemed like a bad dream. When I asked around about the mansion, no one knew of any such place in the area. The cab driver, the mansion, the voices, everything seemed to have vanished into thin air. To this day I can't explain what happened on that rainy night in New Orleans, but I've never taken a cab in that city again. It was an ordinary night, or at least it should have been. I was alone in my small, two-bedroom apartment, enjoying the rare quiet after a long day. The city outside buzzed with its usual energy, but inside my place it was peaceful, almost serene. I had just finished dinner and was settling in on the couch with a book when I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. My heart skipped a beat. I was certain I had locked it after coming in. My mind immediately raced to the worst possible scenarios. Had someone broken in? Was there a stranger in my home? I set the book aside and slowly got up, trying to keep my breathing steady. The living room was dark, the only light coming from a dim lamp in the corner. I walked cautiously towards the door, every step feeling like an eternity. The door was open, just a crack. I could see the dim light from the hallway filtering through. I swallowed hard and reached for the door handle, pulling it shut with a quiet but firm click. I locked it, twisting the deadbolt for good measure, and stood there for a moment, listening for any sound of movement. The silence was almost oppressive. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly earlier. It wasn't unheard of, especially on a night when I was so tired. I double-checked the lock, making sure it was secure, then walked back to the couch. I tried to focus on my book, but the sense of unease lingered. Every creak, every distant noise made me jump. It was ridiculous, I told myself. There was nothing to worry about. But then, just as I started to relax, I heard it again, the door creaking open. This time my heart wasn't just skipping beats, it was racing. I froze, my eyes wide as I stared in the direction of the hallway. The door was open again, just a crack, exactly like before. I slowly got up, my hands trembling as I approached the door. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Was it a prank? Was someone messing with me? Or was it something worse? I reached the door and peeked through the crack. The hallway was empty, just as it had been earlier. I pulled the door shut, this time slamming it with more force than intended. I locked it again, twisting the deadbolt until it couldn't turn any further. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, trying to calm down. It was just a draft, I told myself, or maybe the doorframe was warped. There had to be a logical explanation. I decided to distract myself, turning on the TV to fill the apartment with some noise. I put on a mindless sitcom, hoping the laughter and bright colors would drive away the fear that had taken root inside me. But it didn't help. My eyes kept darting to the door, half expecting it to creak open again. I was on edge. Every sound in the apartment amplified by my heightened senses. Minutes passed, then hours. The door stayed shut, and I started to feel foolish for letting myself get so worked up. I was exhausted, and sleep was starting to seem like a good idea. I turned off the TV, leaving just the lamp on, and headed to the bathroom to brush my teeth. As I was finishing up, I heard it again. The sound of the door opening, my heart felt like it stopped altogether. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone from the counter and dialed 911 as I walked back into the living room. I could see the door from where I stood. It was wide open, much wider than before. The hallway beyond was dark, the shadows almost seeming to reach into the apartment. The operator's voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, as I explained what was happening. They assured me that officers were on their way, and that I should stay on the line. I kept my eyes on the door, my hand gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could hear the operator asking me questions, but I barely registered them. My focus was entirely on the door, on the darkness beyond it. Minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. I kept expecting someone or something to step through that doorway, to come into my home uninvited. But nothing happened. The door just stood there, open and silent. The police arrived quickly, their lights flashing through the windows. As they pulled up to the building, I let them in, explaining everything again as they inspected the apartment. They checked the hallway, the stairwell, and even the outside of the building, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been inside other than me. They reassured me that the door was probably just malfunctioning, that it could have been a draft or a misaligned frame causing it to open on its own. They suggested I get the door checked by a locksmith and offered to stay until I felt safe. I thanked them, but as soon as they left, the fear crept back in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the explanation they gave didn't add up. I locked the door again, triple-checking it this time. I even wedged a chair under the handle for extra security. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside made me flinch. I kept imagining the door opening again, seeing it in my mind's eye swinging open slowly, silently, as if beckoning something or someone inside. The night dragged on, and I finally drifted off just before dawn, but it was a restless, fitful sleep. The next morning, I called the locksmith as soon as the office opened. They came out within the hour and inspected the door. The locksmith didn't find anything wrong with it, no damage, no warping. It was a solid, sturdy door, they said. I felt a pit in my stomach as they left, no closer to understanding what had happened. I tried to go about my day, but the fear lingered. I couldn't concentrate at work, and when I got home, the sight of that door sent a shiver down my spine. That night I set up a camera in the living room, pointed directly at the door. I needed to know if it happened again, needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I sat on the couch, watching TV, but not really paying attention. My eyes kept drifting to the door, the camera's red light blinking softly in the dim room. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I started to relax, thinking maybe it really had been just a fluke. But then, just after midnight, the door creaked open again. My heart leapt into my throat. The camera was recording, and I didn't move, didn't dare get up. The door opened wider this time, slowly swinging inward until it was fully open. The hallway beyond was dark, just like before. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera feed. It was recording everything, the door opening on its own, the empty hallway beyond. I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. There was no logical explanation for this. I wanted to call the police again, but what could I tell them? That my door was haunted. They would think I was crazy. I locked the door once more, watching as it swung shut on the camera feed. I stayed up all night, staring at that door, waiting for it to move again. But it didn't. The rest of the night was uneventful, but the fear didn't go away. The next morning, I reviewed the footage, hoping to see something, anything that could explain what was happening. But all I saw was the door opening on its own, slowly and silently, with no sign of what was causing it. I showed the footage to a few friends, but they were as baffled as I was. Some joked that I had a ghost, but there was no humor in their voices. They were genuinely concerned, and so was I. Over the next few nights, the door continued to open on its own. Sometimes it would happen once, sometimes multiple times in a night. The camera recorded it all, but the footage never revealed anything new. Just the door opening and closing, as if it had a mind of its own. I eventually couldn't take it anymore. I moved out, breaking my lease early and finding a new place across town. The fear of that door, of what might be lurking behind it, was too much to bear. I never figured out what caused it, and I didn't want to. Even now, in my new apartment, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, half expecting to hear that familiar creak, to see the door slowly swinging open. The memory of those nights haunts me, a reminder that sometimes the things you can't explain are the ones that scare us the most. It was a warm summer evening when I took up the job as a park ranger at the sprawling Appalachian Trail. The mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks kissing the sky, and the dense forest within seemed to hold centuries of secrets. I had always loved the outdoors, and this seemed like the perfect job to combine my passion with my work. My supervisor, an older man named Greg, briefed me on my duties. Mostly mundane tasks like checking trails, monitoring wildlife, and assisting hikers, but he also mentioned something peculiar. "There's one area you need to be careful about," he said, his eyes narrowing. "The Blackwood Forest. It's an old part of the trail, barely used nowadays. Just make sure no one wanders in there. We don't need any unnecessary problems." I found it odd, but didn't question him. After all, every place has its own quirks, right? The first few weeks were uneventful, filled with routine patrols, occasional encounters with hikers, and the soothing sounds of nature. But there was always a nagging curiosity about the Blackwood Forest. One evening, I was about to clock out when a group of hikers came into the ranger station, asking for a detailed map of the trail. They were seasoned hikers, the kind who thrived on exploring the less traveled paths. After giving them the necessary information, I noticed one of them pointing at a section of the map, the Blackwood Forest. "What's this area? Looks interesting," he asked, his tone excited. I hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's an old part of the trail, not recommended for hiking anymore. The terrain is rough, and it's easy to get lost. I'd suggest you avoid it." They exchanged glances, clearly intrigued. "We like a challenge. Maybe we'll check it out tomorrow," one of them said with a grin. Despite my warnings, I could see their minds were set. They left the station, thanking me for the help, but I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that settled in my gut. The next day, I decided to patrol the area near Blackwood Forest just in case they decided to go through with their plan. As I neared the entrance to the forest, I noticed the dense canopy of trees overhead, casting an eerie gloom even in the daylight. The trail here was almost non-existent, overgrown with shrubs and vines, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim the land. I found no sign of the hikers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The forest was quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves absent. I walked a little further and that's when I noticed it a faint trail, barely visible, leading deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The deeper I went, the more the atmosphere changed. The trees seemed older, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity drove me forward. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon an old cabin, hidden deep within the forest. It looked abandoned, the wooden structure weathered and worn. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the cabin was dark, the only light coming from the cracks in the walls. The air was musty, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had set foot here in years. But what caught my attention was the wall opposite the door. It was covered in newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. I moved closer, my heart pounding as I read the headlines. They were all about missing hikers, their photos staring back at me, eyes filled with the hope and excitement of adventure. But there was something else, something more disturbing. Been keeping track. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. These weren't just random articles. Someone had been watching these hikers, marking them as they disappeared. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there, report this to the authorities. But as I turned to leave, I heard a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the shadows of the cabin. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was low, almost a growl, sending a jolt of fear through my body. I spun around, but the cabin was empty. Panic set in, and I bolted out the door, sprinting back down the trail. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and bending as if trying to trap me. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. But I didn't stop until I was back at the ranger station. I slammed the door shut, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I immediately called Greg, telling him everything I had seen. His response was not what I expected. "I told you to stay away from that place," he said, his voice cold and distant. "There are things in those woods that shouldn't be disturbed. It's best you forget what you saw." His words left me in stunned silence. What was he hiding? Why hadn't he warned me more strongly? The next day, I went back to the cabin with a few other rangers, determined to find evidence of what I had seen. But when we reached the spot, there was nothing there. The cabin was gone, as if it had never existed. The forest looked the same, overgrown and ancient, but the trail I had followed was no longer visible. The other rangers looked at me with concern, as if I had lost my mind. I tried to explain what I had seen, but without any proof. They dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a result of fatigue or stress. But I knew what I had seen, the cabin, the clippings, the voice. None of it was imagined. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, something malevolent, watching, waiting. I left the ranger service soon after, unable to continue working in a place that held so many secrets, but the memory of that day haunts me still. Sometimes I dream of the Blackwood forest, of the cabin hidden within its depths, and the feeling of being watched. I've heard stories from other rangers over the years, whispers of strange occurrences, of hikers who vanish without a trace. But no one talks about it openly. It's as if the forest has a way of silencing those who know too much. And now I can't help but wonder how many others have found that cabin. How many more have been marked by whatever lurks in those woods? And why was I allowed to leave? These are questions I'll never have answers to. But one thing is certain, I'll never step foot in those woods again. Working the night shift at St. Augustine's Hospital was something I had grown accustomed to over the years. The quiet halls, the dim lights, and the occasional soft beeping of monitors became my companions. But one night, everything changed, and it's a night I can't forget. No matter how hard I tried. It started like any other shift. I was a nurse in the intensive care unit, and my job was to monitor the patients, administer medication, and respond to any emergencies. The ICU was located on the hospital's 4th floor, a place that had always felt colder than the rest of the building, though I never paid much attention to it. The old hospital had been standing for over a century, with its original structure dating back to the early 1900s. Over the years, it had seen numerous renovations, expansions, and technological upgrades. But there was always something about the 4th floor, something that felt different. That night, there were only 3 patients in the ICU, all of them in critical condition but stable. My colleague, Clara, and I were the only nurses on duty. The night was slow, with nothing out of the ordinary happening. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take a quick break and headed to the nurses' lounge for a cup of coffee. As I sipped the hot drink, I heard a faint sound, almost like a soft humming, coming from the hallway outside the lounge. I paused, listening closely. It wasn't uncommon to hear strange noises in the old hospital, but this was different, more deliberate, like someone was singing a lullaby. I put down my cup and stepped into the hallway. The sound grew louder, but it was still faint, almost as if it was coming from a distance. I walked towards the source of the noise, my curiosity piqued. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of room 404, a room that had been empty for weeks due to ongoing maintenance. The hospital had a rule that no patients were to be placed in that room until the repairs were completed. As I approached room 404, the humming stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was unnerving, and I hesitated before reaching for the doorknob. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open slowly, peering inside. The room was dark, with only the faint glow of the street lights outside filtering through the window. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and that's when I saw her, a woman standing by the bed, her back to me, humming softly as she rocked back and forth. My heart skipped a beat. I knew there were no patients in this room, and the woman wasn't wearing a hospital gown. She was dressed in a white nightgown, her long dark hair cascading down her back. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. "Excuse me, ma'am," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "You're not supposed to be in here. Are you lost?" The woman didn't respond. She continued to hum, her voice soft and melodic, almost hypnotic. I took a step closer, my hand reaching for the light switch on the wall. But as soon as my fingers brushed against it, the humming stopped again. The woman turned slowly to face me, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with dark hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. Her lips were bloodless, twisted into a faint, eerie smile. But it was her eyes that truly terrified me. There was something unnatural about them, something that made my blood run cold. I froze, unable to move, unable to look away. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there staring at each other. Then, without a word, the woman turned and walked towards the window. She placed her hand on the glass, and in that moment, I could see the faint outline of a handprint, as if someone had pressed their hand against the window from the outside. But we were on the 4th floor. There was no way anyone could have reached that window. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I bolted out of the room, my heart racing as I ran down the hallway. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station, where Clara was sitting, looking up at me with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked. Noticing the fear in my eyes, I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing as I struggled to find the words. There's someone in room for 104, I managed to say, my voice shaking. Clara frowned, clearly confused. "But that room's empty," she said, standing up. "Are you sure you weren't imagining things?" "I know what I saw," I insisted, my voice rising with desperation. "She was there, a woman in a white nightgown. We need to check it out." Clara grabbed a flashlight from the desk, and we headed back to room 404 together. My hands were trembling, but I felt a bit more reassured with Clara by my side. When we reached the room, Clara pushed the door open, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, just as I had found it earlier. The bed was neatly made, the equipment untouched. There was no sign of the woman I had seen. But when Clara shone the flashlight towards the window, we both saw it, the handprint, faint but unmistakable, pressed against the glass from the outside. Clara's face went pale, and she quickly backed away from the window. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that what I had seen wasn't a hallucination. There was something in that room, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Clara and I decided not to report the incident to our supervisor, knowing that no one would believe us. But from that night on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I worked the night shift. A few nights later, I was back in the ICU, trying to put the incident behind me. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard it again, the soft humming, echoing through the hallway. My blood ran cold, and I immediately recognized the tune. It was the same lullaby I had heard that night in room 404. I didn't want to investigate, but I couldn't ignore it either. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. This time the humming led me to room 408, another empty room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, just like room 404 had been. My hands were clammy as I pushed it open, bracing myself for what I might see. But the room was empty. The humming had stopped the moment I opened the door. I stood there, my nerves on edge, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The room was silent, the air thick with an unsettling tension. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange, a faint, shadowy figure in the corner of the room, almost like a mist. It was barely visible, but I could see the outline of a woman, her form flickering in and out of view. My breath caught in my throat as the figure seemed to move towards me. Slowly and deliberately, I backed away, my hands shaking, but the figure kept coming closer. I could feel the coldness in the air, the temperature dropping rapidly. It was as if the room itself was freezing over. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I was frozen in place, unable to move, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room returned to its normal temperature, and the eerie silence settled over me once again. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I bolted out of the room, not stopping until I was back at the nurse's station. Clara was there, her eyes wide with fear. I heard it, too, she said before I could say anything. The humming. It was in room 406. I checked, but there was nothing there. We both knew then that something was very wrong in the hospital. Over the next few weeks, more strange incidents occurred. The humming continued, always in different rooms, always leading us to places where no one should have been. We started hearing footsteps in the hallways, whispers in the dead of night, and once I even saw the shadowy figure again, lurking near the entrance to the ICU. Patients began to report strange occurrences as well, objects moving on their own, cold spots in their rooms, and the feeling of being watched. But whenever we tried to investigate, we found nothing. The doctors dismissed it as the imagination of stressed nurses and patients, but Clara and I knew better. We had seen the handprint, heard the humming, and felt the presence of something otherworldly. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. The fear and anxiety became too much, and I decided to transfer to another hospital. Clara stayed behind, but we kept in touch. She told me that the strange occurrences continued, even escalating over time. More staff began to experience the unexplainable, and the hospital gained a reputation for being haunted. To this day, I still wonder what I encountered in St. Augustine's Hospital. Was it the spirit of a former patient, unable to move on, or was it something darker, something malevolent that had taken root in the old building? I may never know the truth, but one thing is certain: I will never work the night shift in a hospital again. When I took the job as a night shift supervisor at the old textile factory, I wasn't expecting anything more than a steady paycheck and long, quiet nights. The factory had been around for decades, a hulking mass of brick and steel on the outskirts of town. It had once been a thriving business, but now it was mostly automated, with only a handful of employees overseeing the machines that ran through the night. My first few nights were uneventful, almost mind-numbingly so. The machines hummed in their endless rhythm, the conveyor belts clicked and clattered, and the fluorescent lights flickered with that dull, cold glow that always seemed to make time stretch. There was something eerie about the emptiness of the place, but I chalked it up to my own imagination. The factory was so big that even with the machines running, it felt like a ghost town. I spent my nights walking the factory floor, checking the machines, and making sure everything was running smoothly. The monotony was broken only by the occasional need to adjust a setting or clear a jam. I got used to the routine, the silence, and the solitude. But then, about a week into the job, things started to change. It began with the noises, strange, inexplicable sounds that didn't belong to any of the machines. I'd be walking the floor, and suddenly I'd hear a faint tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on one of the metal workbenches. Or there'd be a soft scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the concrete floor. Every time I heard one of these noises, I'd stop and listen, trying to pinpoint the source. But as soon as I did, the noise would stop, leaving only the hum of the machines in its wake. I started to feel uneasy, the hair on the back of my neck standing up whenever the factory fell silent. One night I was making my rounds when I heard something that froze me in my tracks. It was a whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, a soft, breathy voice just at the edge of hearing. It sounded like it was coming from one of the darkened corners of the factory, where the shadows seemed to gather like thick, black smoke. I turned my flashlight on and shone it in the direction of the voice, but there was nothing there, just an empty workstation, the tools neatly arranged, the machines humming along as usual. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or maybe a trick of the acoustics in the massive, empty space. But deep down I knew that wasn't the case. The voice had been too clear, too deliberate. I tried to shake it off, but from that night on the factory felt different. The air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, half expecting to see someone or something standing behind me. But there was never anything there. A few nights later, I was in the break room trying to relax with a cup of coffee. The room was small and windowless, with just a couple of tables, a fridge, and a microwave. It was the only place in the factory that felt somewhat cozy, with its faded posters on the walls and the old, mismatched chairs. I was sitting there, staring blankly at the clock on the wall, when I heard the whisper again. This time it was clearer, louder, and unmistakably close. It sounded like it was coming from right behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. My coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor, spilling its contents across the tiles. I stood there, frozen, listening as the whisper faded into silence. It felt like the room had dropped 10 degrees. I grabbed my things and got out of there as fast as I could. I spent the rest of the night in my office, with the door locked and the lights on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started hearing the whispers more frequently after that, always when I was alone on the factory floor or in the break room. They seemed to come from the shadows, from the darkened corners where the light from my flashlight couldn't quite reach. And it wasn't just the whispers. I began to see things out of the corner of my eye, flickers of movement, dark shapes darting between the machines. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. The factory became a nightmare, a place of creeping dread and unseen terror. I started dreading my shifts, counting down the hours until I could leave. But the worst was yet to come. One night, I was doing my rounds when the power went out. The factory was plunged into darkness, the machines grinding to a halt with a deafening silence. My heart skipped a beat as I fumbled for my flashlight, the darkness pressing in around me like a suffocating blanket. I clicked the flashlight on, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the thick blackness. I could hear the whispers again, but this time they were louder, more insistent. It was as if they were surrounding me, coming from all directions. Panic set in, and I started to move quickly through the factory, heading towards the control room where the backup generators were located. My footsteps echoed eerily in the silence, the whispers growing louder with each step I took. As I reached the control room door, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. I turned around, shining my flashlight back the way I'd come, but there was nothing there, just the empty factory floor, shrouded in darkness. I didn't wait to find out what was making that noise. I bolted into the control room, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to get the backup generators online. When the lights finally flickered back on, I half expected to see something horrific on the other side of the door, but the hallway was empty. The whispers stopped as soon as the light came back on, leaving only the hum of the machines and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I finished my shift in a daze, barely able to focus on anything but getting out of that factory. When the morning shift arrived, I practically ran out of the building, my nerves shot. I knew I couldn't go back there. The fear was too much, too real. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. I didn't care about the job anymore. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. A few days later, I got a call from the day shift supervisor. They told me that the factory was being shut down for good. The owners had decided to close early due to ongoing issues with the equipment and the building itself. I didn't ask for details. I was just relieved I'd never have to set foot in that place again. But the experience left me with a lingering sense of dread, a fear that I can't quite shake. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still hear those whispers, faint and distant, as if they're following me, waiting for the right moment to return. I never believed in curses or dark magic, at least not until I found myself on the shores of Silver Lake, an isolated body of water nestled deep within the woods of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Derek, and I was an avid hiker and amateur treasure hunter, always searching for hidden gems and artifacts from bygone eras. The stories about Silver Lake had always intrigued me, tales of a lost treasure, buried somewhere along its banks, hidden by the notorious outlaw James One-Eyed McGraw. But there was more to the legend. Locals whisper that McGraw had cursed the treasure with a dark spell, ensuring that anyone who sought it would meet a terrible fate. It was a late summer afternoon when I decided to set out on my quest. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the sun casting a golden hue over the dense forest. I had done my research, studying old maps, and digging through historical records to pinpoint the most likely location of the treasure. Armed with my metal detector, a shovel, and a sense of adventure, I felt more than prepared to uncover what had been hidden for over a century. The hike to Silver Lake was challenging, with steep inclines and thick underbrush. But I pressed on, driven by the possibility of finding something truly remarkable. After several hours, I reached the lake, its waters shimmering under the afternoon sun. The area was eerily quiet, with only the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird breaking the silence. I began my search along the northern shore, where I believed McGraw might have buried his loot. The metal detector hummed as I swept it across the ground, hoping for that telltale beep that would signal the discovery of something metallic. For hours, I found nothing but rusted nails, old soda cans, and bits of scrap metal disappointments, but not enough to dissuade me from continuing my search. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, my metal detector suddenly went off, emitting a high-pitched beep that sent a jolt of excitement through me. The signal was strong, and I knew I had found something significant. I quickly set down the detector and began to dig, my heart pounding with anticipation. The soil was loose, making it easy to excavate, and within minutes I hit something solid, a wooden box, partially rotted but still intact. My hands trembled as I carefully pried open the box, revealing its contents. A small chest made of tarnished silver, ornately decorated with intricate engravings. It was heavy, much heavier than I had expected, and I could feel the weight of whatever was inside. This was it, the lost treasure of James One-Eyed McGraw. But as I lifted the chest from the ground, a sudden chill ran down my spine. The air around me grew cold, unnaturally so, and the once peaceful atmosphere of Silver Lake took on a menacing tone. The shadows seemed to lengthen, creeping towards me as if they were alive, and the gentle breeze turned into a biting wind that howled through the trees. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Ignoring the growing sense of dread, I forced open the chest, revealing a collection of gold coins, jewels, and old, crumbling documents. The sight should have filled me with joy, but instead I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The treasure was real, but so was the curse. As I examined the contents of the chest, I noticed a piece of parchment, yellowed with age, tucked beneath the coins. It was covered in strange symbols and writing that I couldn't decipher. But there was one word, written in bold, that stood out. Vengeance. The moment I read it, the wind howled louder, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. I shoved the parchment back into the chest, suddenly eager to leave. But as I stood up, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a burning sensation that spread rapidly through my body. I gasped, clutching my chest as the pain intensified, my vision blurring as I stumbled backward. The world around me seemed to spin, and I collapsed to the ground, my body convulsing as the curse took hold. The last thing I saw before darkness consumed me was the chest, glowing with a faint, malevolent light. When I awoke, it was dark, the stars twinkling overhead as the full moon cast an eerie glow over Silver Lake. I felt weak, drained, as if my very life force had been sucked out of me. The chest was still there, its lid closed, but the sense of dread had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger. I knew I had to leave, but as I tried to stand, my legs gave out beneath me. It was as if the ground itself was holding me in place, refusing to let me go. Panic set in, and I crawled towards the edge of the lake, desperate to put distance between myself and the cursed treasure. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape. The shadows seemed to follow me, their cold, inky tendrils wrapping around my limbs, pulling me back towards the chest. My breathing became labored, and I could feel my heart racing, pounding in my ears as the curse tightened its grip. I cried out for help, but my voice was swallowed by the wind, carried away into the night. I was alone, trapped by my own greed and foolishness, and there was no one to save me. The pain in my chest returned, sharper and more intense than before, and I doubled over, clutching at my heart. I could feel something dark and malevolent inside me, spreading through my veins like poison. My vision dim, and I knew I was dying, the curse taking its final toll. But just as I was about to lose consciousness, the wind suddenly died down, and the shadows retreated, releasing their hold on me. The pain subsided, leaving me gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion. I lay there for what felt like hours, too weak to move until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. When I finally managed to stand, the chest was gone, leaving behind only a shallow hole in the ground where it had been buried. The treasure, the curse, everything had vanished, as if it had never been there, but I knew better. The curse was real, and it had spared me, though I didn't know why. I never returned to Silver Lake, and I never spoke of what happened to anyone, but the experience left me scarred, both physically and mentally. I lost my taste for treasure hunting, and the mere thought of it fills me with a deep, irrational fear. Even now, years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and trembling, haunted by the memories of that cursed treasure and the darkness that nearly claimed my life. I don't know where the chest went or if it will ever resurface, but one thing is certain: if you ever find yourself near Silver Lake, heed my warning and stay far away. The curse of James One-Eyed McGraw is real, and it's more powerful than you can imagine. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and I decided to host a small dinner party at my apartment. I had just moved to a new city for work, and it seemed like a good opportunity to get to know my neighbors. I invited 3 people from the building: Mrs. Alvarez, the sweet old lady from down the hall, Nick, the tech-savvy guy from the floor above, and Clara, a recent college grad who had just moved in next door. The evening started off well enough. We all gathered in my cozy little living room, chatting about the usual small talk topics: work, the weather, and the quirks of our old, creaky apartment building. The food was simple but decent: pasta, salad, and a few bottles of wine to share. It was the kind of night that felt comfortable, like we were all just trying to find a sense of community in this big, impersonal city. But then, as we were settling in to eat, there was a knock at the door. It was an odd sound, soft but insistent, like someone was tapping with their knuckles rather than knocking outright. I paused, fork halfway to my mouth, and glanced around at my guests. They looked as surprised as I was. "Are you expecting anyone else?" Clara asked, her brow furrowed. I shook my head, puzzled. "No, just you three." The knock came again, a little louder this time. I got up from the table, wiping my hands on a napkin as I walked to the door. I didn't have a peephole, so I had no choice but to open it without knowing who was on the other side. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with unkempt dark hair and a scruffy beard. His clothes were rumpled, and his eyes had a strange, faraway look in them. He smiled, but there was something off about it, like he was trying too hard to seem friendly. "Hi," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "I'm here for dinner." My mind raced. I hadn't invited this man, and I didn't know who he was. He didn't look like anyone I had seen in the building before. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry," I finally managed, "but I think you might have the wrong apartment." "I'm not sure we've met." The man's smile didn't waver. "Oh, no, I'm in the right place," he insisted. "I was invited. It wouldn't be polite to turn me away, now would it?" Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. There was an underlying tone in his voice, something that made it clear he wasn't asking. I glanced back at my guests, who were watching the exchange with growing unease. Nick stood up, clearly ready to back me up if things got weird, but before I could say anything else, the man stepped inside, brushing past me as if he had every right to be there. He walked over to the dining table, his eyes scanning the room, and then he pulled out the empty chair at the end of the table and sat down. The room fell silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mrs. Alvarez looked at me, her eyes wide with confusion. Clara was gripping her fork like it was a weapon, and Nick was staring at the man with a look of wary suspicion. "You made pasta," the man said, reaching for the bowl in the center of the table. "My favorite." He served himself a heaping portion, completely oblivious to the fact that everyone else had stopped eating. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to ask him to leave, to tell him this was private gathering and that he needed to go. But something about him made me hesitate. It wasn't just the way he had invited himself in or the way he spoke as if he belonged there. It was the feeling that if I asked him to leave, things would get a lot worse. So I did the only thing I could think of. I sat back down, forcing a smile as I tried to defuse the situation. "Well, I guess there's plenty to go around," I said, my voice betraying the nerves I was trying to hide. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." The man looked at me, his eyes locking on to mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Call me Oliver," he said. "I'm just passing through. Thought I'd join you all for a meal." The way he said it made it sound like he was doing us a favor, like we should be grateful for his presence. The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said anything. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, the friendly dinner party now feeling more like a hostage situation. Oliver ate. His food was slow, deliberate movements, savoring each bite as if it were the best meal he'd ever had. The rest of us barely touched our plates. Every time I tried to make conversation, he would steer it back to himself, offering vague, unsettling comments about how he had been everywhere and seen everything. There was an unsettling edge to his words, like he was hinting at something dark and hidden just beneath the surface. As the meal dragged on, I noticed something strange. The room seemed to be getting colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow longer, darker. The candles I lit earlier flickered, their flames guttering as if struggling against a sudden draft. But there were no windows open. And then there was the smell of faint, acrid odor that grew stronger as the night went on. It was like burning hair, sharp and unpleasant, and it seemed to cling to Oliver like a second skin. At one point, Mrs. Alvarez excused herself to go to the bathroom, but she never came back. When I went to check on her, I found the bathroom door locked. I knocked, but there was no answer. My stomach twisted with anxiety, but I didn't want to alarm the others, so I pretended like everything was fine. I returned to the table, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Eventually, the dinner came to an end. Oliver finished his meal, wiping his mouth with a napkin before standing up. "Well, that was delightful," he said, his voice dripping with a false warmth. "But I think it's time for me to be on my way." Relief flooded through me. I nodded quickly, eager to see him leave. "Of course, thanks for joining us," I said, trying to keep my tone polite. Oliver walked to the door, but before he left, he turned back to us, his smile fading. "Be careful who you invite into your home," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Not everyone is as friendly as I am." And with that, he was gone, slipping out into the night like a shadow. As soon as the door closed behind him, the temperature in the room returned to normal, and the smell dissipated. But the unease lingered, a heavy, oppressive feeling that hung over the apartment. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, all of us too shaken to speak. Finally, Nick stood up, muttering something about needing to get home. Clara followed suit, her hands trembling as she gathered her things. I walked them to the door, still in a daze. After they left, I went to check on Mrs. Alvarez again. The bathroom door was still locked, and this time, when I knocked, there was no response. Panic surged through me. I called out her name, but there was only silence. I had no choice but to force the door open. What I found inside chilled me to the bone. The bathroom was empty, completely empty. There were no signs of Mrs. Alvarez, no indication that she had ever been there. The towels were neatly folded, the sink dry, and the air was still. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. My hands shook as I backed out of the bathroom, my mind racing to make sense of what had happened. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, couldn't fathom how someone could just disappear like that. I called the police, but when they arrived, they found no evidence of foul play. Mrs. Alvarez was simply gone, and no one could explain how or why. The officers looked at me with suspicion, but they had nothing to go on, so they left me with a warning to call them if I remembered anything else. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Oliver's face, heard his voice in my head warning me to be careful. The next day, I learned that Mrs. Alvarez had no family, no close friends, no one who would come looking for her. She had lived alone, a quiet, solitary life, and now she was just another missing person in a city full of them. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Oliver was still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. I started avoiding my neighbors, withdrawing into my apartment, too afraid to open the door to anyone. I never hosted another dinner party. The thought of inviting someone into my home, of letting them into my life, filled me with a deep, paralyzing fear. And every time I hear a knock at the door, I freeze, my heart racing as I wait to see who or what is on the other side. I'll never forget that night, the night I learned the true meaning of an uninvited guest. And I'll always wonder what really happened to Mrs. Alvarez, and if Oliver will ever come back. But one thing is certain, I'll never make the mistake of opening my door to a stranger again. I've always been a man who loved solitude, especially in the great outdoors. The idea of spending a week alone in the woods, far from the noise and chaos of the city, was something I looked forward to all year. So when my buddy Jake told me about an isolated cabin up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I jumped at the opportunity. He'd mentioned it was old and a bit run-down, but that didn't bother me. In fact, it made it all the more appealing. A place with character, history, and, most importantly, peace. The drive up was long and winding, the narrow roads cutting through dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. Cabin 9 stood at the edge of the woods, its weathered wooden walls and sagging roof giving it an air of quiet resignation. It was clear this place hadn't seen much care in years, but it was still standing, and that was enough for me. I parked my truck and unloaded my gear, feeling a sense of calm wash over me as I breathed in the crisp mountain air. This was exactly what I needed, a week to myself, away from work, stress, and the constant demands of daily life. I'd brought enough food, water, and supplies to last the week, along with a few books and my fishing gear. The cabin was rustic, with no electricity or running water, but it had a small wood stove, a rickety old bed, and a few pieces of mismatched furniture. It was perfect. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal, and settled into an old armchair with a book. The wind whispered through the trees outside, and the only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. I fell asleep easily, the silence wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I'd spent the day fishing at a nearby stream, enjoying the quiet and the simplicity of it all. When I returned to the cabin that evening, the sun was just dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I made dinner, ate, and then decided to head to bed early. As I lay there, listening to the wind outside, I started to hear something else, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere within the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a mouse or some other small creature. The cabin was old, after all, and probably full of little nooks and crannies where animals could hide. But as I listened, the scratching grew louder, more deliberate, like something was trying to claw its way through the walls. I sat up in bed, my heart beginning to race, and strained to hear where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from behind the walls, near the floor, but when I got up to investigate, the scratching stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal, and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear that scratching again, faint but persistent, like something trying to get in or out. The next morning, I searched the cabin from top to bottom, looking for any signs of an animal, but found nothing. No droppings, no holes in the walls, nothing that could explain the noise. I've always been a man who loved solitude, especially in the great outdoors. The idea of spending a week alone in the woods, far from the noise and chaos of the city, was something I looked forward to all year. So when my buddy Jake told me about an isolated cabin up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I jumped at the opportunity. He'd mentioned it was old and a bit run down, but that didn't bother me. In fact, it made it all the more appealing. A place with character, history, and, most importantly, peace. The drive up was long and winding, the narrow roads cutting through dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. Cabin 9 stood at the edge of the woods, its weathered wooden walls and sagging roof giving it an air of quiet resignation. It was clear this place hadn't seen much care in years, but it was still standing, and that was enough for me. I parked my truck and unloaded my gear, feeling a sense of calm wash over me as I breathed in the crisp mountain air. This was exactly what I needed, a week to myself, away from work, stress, and the constant demands of daily life. I'd brought enough food, water, and supplies to last the week, along with a few boats and my fishing gear. The cabin was rustic, with no electricity or running water, but it had a small wood stove, a rickety old bed, and a few pieces of mismatched furniture. It was perfect. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal, and settled into an old armchair with a book. The wind whispered through the trees outside, and the only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. I fell asleep easily, the silence wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I'd spent the day fishing at a nearby stream, enjoying the quiet and the simplicity of it all. When I returned to the cabin that evening, the sun was just dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I made dinner, ate, and then decided to head to bed early. As I lay there, listening to the wind outside, I started to hear something else, a faint scratching sound, coming from somewhere within the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a mouse or some other small creature. The cabin was old, after all, and probably full of little nooks and crannies where animals could hide. But as I listened, the scratching grew louder, more deliberate, like something was trying to claw its way through the walls. I sat up in bed, my heart beginning to race, and strained to hear where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from behind the walls, near the floor, but when I got up to investigate, the scratching stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal, and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear that scratching again, faint but persistent, like something trying to get in or out. The next morning, I searched the cabin from top to bottom, looking for any signs of an animal, but found nothing. No droppings, no holes in the walls, nothing that could explain the noise. "Stay?" she asked with a polite smile. I hesitated, not sure how to explain what had happened. There was something wrong with the cabin, I finally said, my voice shaky. Her smile faded, and she glanced around the room as if to make sure no one else was listening. "You were in cabin 9, weren't you?" she asked, her tone low and serious. I nodded, and she sighed, looking down at her hands. "I should have warned you," she said quietly, "that cabin, it's not right. We've had others come back early, too, saying the same things, noises, whispers, things moving on their own. Some people say it's haunted, that something bad happened there a long time ago." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What happened?" I asked, dreading the answer. She shook her head. "No one knows for sure. The records are old, and there's nothing concrete but the stories. They say a man went mad there, killed his family, and then himself. Others say it was a place where dark rituals were performed, that something evil was summoned and never left. Whatever it is, it's been there for a long time, and it doesn't like visitors." I left the rental office with a heavy heart, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had experienced. I'd always been a skeptic, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. But after what happened in Cabin 9, I wasn't so sure anymore. I knew one thing for certain: I would never go back there, and I would never forget the terror I felt in that old, isolated cabin in the woods. Warehouse 9 was known among the workers as the place you didn't want to be alone in after dark. It was an old, crumbling building on the edge of town, once bustling with activity, but now barely functional. The company that owned it had long since moved most of their operations to a newer facility, leaving Warehouse 9 as a forgotten relic. But for some reason, they kept it running just enough to justify the occasional shipment or storage job. I was one of the night security guards assigned to patrol the place. It wasn't the kind of job you bragged about. The pay was decent, and the hours were long, but it was a job, and I needed one. The first few nights were uneventful. The place was cold, damp, and filled with the echoes of a once busy warehouse. The only sounds were the distant hum of machinery, the occasional creak of the old metal beams, and the wind howling through the broken windows. My routine was simple: walk the perimeter, check the doors and windows, and make sure everything was locked up tight. There wasn't much to do, so I brought a book to read during my breaks, hoping to pass the time. But on the fourth night, things started to change. It was around midnight when I first heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. It echoed through the empty corridors, faint but persistent. I paused, straining to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I shrugged it off as the wind or some loose piece of metal banging against something. But as the night wore on, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I continued my rounds, trying to ignore the noise, but it followed me, growing louder with each step. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly as I made my way toward the source of the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But the tapping continued, louder now, echoing through the warehouse like a drumbeat. My heart raced as I walked deeper into the building, the sound guiding me to an old storage room at the far end of the warehouse. The door was slightly ajar, the lock broken and rusted from years of neglect. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was empty, save for a few old crates and a thick layer of dust that covered everything. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. I shined my flashlight around the room, looking for any sign of what could have caused the noise, but there was nothing, just the empty room and the creeping sense of unease that was starting to settle in my gut. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me and making a mental note to report the broken lock in my log. But as I turned to leave, I heard something else, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing, but it was there, floating through the air like a ghostly breeze. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper grew louder, forming words that I couldn't quite make out. It sounded like a voice, distant and muffled, but unmistakably human. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been moments before, but the whispering continued, growing more urgent, more desperate. I didn't wait to find out what it was saying. I turned and bolted out of the warehouse, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, breathing in the cold night air as I tried to calm down. I radioed my supervisor, telling him I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home early. He didn't ask any questions, just told me to lock up and leave. I didn't tell him about the tapping or the whispering. I wasn't sure he would believe me, and I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But I knew one thing for certain: I didn't want to be alone in that warehouse again. The next night I returned to work, trying to convince myself that what I had heard was just my imagination. But the moment I stepped back into Warehouse 9, the sense of unease returned, stronger than before. The building felt different, like it was alive, watching me with unseen eyes. The tapping started up again, this time louder and more frantic. It echoed through the corridors, filling the space with a maddening rhythm that set my nerves on edge. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my rounds, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispering came next, the same faint voice I had heard the night before. It was clearer now, the words almost discernible, but still just out of reach. I followed the sound, my flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The whispering led me back to the storage room, the door still ajar, the lock still broken. This time I hesitated before entering, my hand trembling as I reached for the door handle. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting something to jump out at me. But the room was empty, just as it had been before. The whispering stopped the moment I stepped inside, replaced by that same oppressive silence. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a small, dusty mirror leaning against the wall. It was old, the glass cloudy and spotted with age. I wiped the dust away, revealing a cracked, distorted reflection of the room, and then I saw it. In the reflection, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure, a man, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. He was watching me, his gaze locked onto mine through the mirror. I spun around, but the room was empty. There was no one there. But when I looked back at the mirror, the man was still there, still smiling, still watching. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure in the mirror moved closer, his smile widening as he reached out toward me. I dropped the flashlight, the beam flickering wildly as it hit the floor. The tapping returned, louder now, like a drumbeat in my head. The whispering grew into a cacophony of voices, all screaming, all pleading. I ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from that room, from that mirror, from whatever was lurking inside it. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't go back into Warehouse 9 that night. I couldn't. I radioed my supervisor, telling him there was something wrong with the building, that it wasn't safe. He didn't believe me, of course, said I was just spooked, that I needed to toughen up if I wanted to keep the job. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. There was something in that warehouse, something old and malevolent, something that had been waiting for a long time, and now it was awake. I quit the job the next day. I couldn't bring myself to go back there, not after what I had experienced, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every night I dreamed of that warehouse, of the tapping, the whispering, the man in the mirror. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of his laughter ringing in my ears. I moved to a new city, hoping to escape the memories, but they followed me, haunting me in the dead of night. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I still hear the tapping, soft but insistent, like it's coming from the walls themselves. And in the darkest hours of the night, when I dare to look in the mirror, I can still see him standing in the corner of the reflection, watching me with those hollow eyes, smiling that twisted smile. I've tried to forget, tried to move on, but I know deep down that I'll never truly escape him. He's always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come back, and I know that one day he will. My name is Arjun, and I've been driving a taxi in Bombay for nearly 20 years. This city has shown me everything: joy, sorrow, life, and even death. But there's one night that stands out among all the others, a night that still chills my bones every time I think about it. It was a humid summer evening, the kind where the air sticks to your skin like a wet cloth. The streets were bustling, as they always are, with people going about their lives, seemingly oblivious to the world around them. I was making my usual rounds, picking up passengers and dropping them off at various corners of the city. It was around midnight, and I found myself near the old Victoria Terminus, now known as Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus. The station, with its Gothic architecture and history, had always fascinated me, but that night it felt different, almost foreboding. I was about to take a break, perhaps grab a cup of chai from a nearby vendor, when I noticed her. A woman stood on the side of the road, her sari shimmering under the dim street lights. She looked out of place, almost as if she had stepped out of another time. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. But what struck me the most was the sadness that seemed to emanate from her. Against my better judgment, I decided to stop and offer her a ride. She climbed into the back seat without a word, her movements slow and deliberate. "Where to, madam?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond immediately, just stared out of the window as if lost in thought. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Marine Drive," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. I nodded and started the engine, the hum of the car breaking the heavy silence. As we drove through the city's winding streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air inside the cab grew colder with each passing minute, a stark contrast to the sticky heat outside. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but her face was obscured by shadows, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The drive to Marine Drive was usually a pleasant one, with the sea breeze and the sight of the waves crashing against the shore. But that night the road seemed longer, darker, and the sea more menacing. When we finally arrived, I pulled over and turned to her. "We're here, madam," I said, hoping she would finally meet my gaze, but she didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my words. I turned around fully, my patience wearing thin. "Madam, we've reached Marine Drive," I repeated, louder this time. That's when I noticed it. The back seat was empty. My heart stopped. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, but there was no one there. The door hadn't opened, and I hadn't heard her leave. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Panic set in. I jumped out of the car and looked around, but there was no sign of her, no indication that she had ever been there. I even checked under the seats, my hands trembling, but found nothing. I was alone. Shaking, I got back into the car and drove back to Victoria Terminus, hoping to find some explanation, some sign that I wasn't losing my mind. But the streets were empty, and the station stood silent, its towering structure looming over me like a dark sentinel. I parked the taxi and sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined her? Was it the exhaustion playing tricks on me? But deep down, I knew the truth. She had been real, or at least, she had been once. The stories came flooding back, tales I had heard from other drivers about the ghostly passengers who haunt the streets of Bombay. Some said they were spirits of those who had died in accidents. Others believed they were souls searching for something they had lost in life. I had always dismissed those stories as superstition, the product of overactive imaginations. But now, sitting in my cab with the memory of that woman's sorrowful eyes burned into my mind, I wasn't so sure. I didn't drive for the rest of the night. I couldn't. I returned home, my mind racing, sleep a distant dream. The next day I visited the temple, seeking solace and protection, hoping the priests could offer some explanation or comfort. They performed a small ritual, blessed my taxi, and told me to be careful, that the city was old and full of restless spirits. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to push the experience out of my mind to convince myself that it had all been a figment of my imagination. But every time I drove past Victoria Terminus or along Marine Drive, I felt a chill, a reminder of that night. I stopped driving late at night, avoiding the routes that took me near the places where she had been. But the memory lingered, a ghost of its own, haunting me. Months later, I heard from another driver about a woman who had died near Marine Drive, hit by a car as she tried to cross the road late one night. She was young, beautiful, and alone, just like the woman I had picked up. The driver said her spirit was still seen wandering the streets, searching for a way home. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. I knew it was her. The haunted taxi of Bombay had claimed another story, another victim, and I was just thankful that I had survived to tell the tale. I never saw her again, but every time I drive past Marine Drive or Victoria Terminus, I can't help but glance at the back seat, half expecting to see her there, waiting for a ride that would never end. The rumors about Hollow Creek had been circulating for years. As a new teacher, I tried to ignore the whispers, attributing them to typical small-town superstition, but the stories persisted, each one more bizarre than the last. Tales of students disappearing, of strange sounds echoing through the halls, of shadows that moved on their own. I didn't believe any of it until I experienced it myself. My first few weeks at the school were uneventful. The building was old, with creaking floors and dim lighting, but it had a certain charm. The students were typical teenagers, some eager to learn, others more interested in their phones than in my lessons. I settled into a routine, teaching English to the juniors and seniors and staying late to grade papers in my classroom. It was during one of these late nights that things started to get strange. It was a Thursday evening, and I was the last one left in the building. The janitors had already finished their rounds and locked up most of the school, leaving me alone in the west wing. I didn't mind the solitude. It was peaceful, and I could focus without the usual distractions. The only sound was the soft scratching of my pen against the paper as I graded essays. Then suddenly the lights flickered. I looked up, frowning at the old fluorescent bulbs above me. They flickered again, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I sat there for a moment, waiting for the lights to come back on. When they didn't, I reached for my phone, using the screen as a makeshift flashlight. I stood up, intending to find the janitor's closet and check the breaker, but then I heard a faint, echoing laugh. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The laugh was high-pitched and eerie, like a child's, but distorted, as if it were coming from a great distance. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or an old pipe creaking, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the hallway. I opened the door, shining my phone's light into the corridor. The hallway was empty, but the laugh continued, bouncing off the walls and sending chills down my spine. I stepped out of the classroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the old gymnasium, a part of the school that hadn't been used in years. The gym was in a state of disrepair, closed off to students due to safety concerns. But now, in the dead of night, it seemed to be calling to me, the laughter echoing from its depths. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave the school and never return. But something curiosity, perhaps, or sheer stubbornness drove me forward. I walked down the hall, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the darkness. The laughter faded as I approached the gym, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a door. The door to the gym was slightly ajar, the lock broken and rusted from years of neglect. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking in protest. The gym was dark, the windows covered in grime, barely allowing any moonlight to filter through. I shone my phone's light around the room, the beam cutting through the shadows. The place was a mess, broken bleachers, torn mats, and dust-covered equipment strewn about. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. In the center of the gym, just beyond the reach of my light, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape standing motionless in the middle of the floor. My heart raced as I took a step closer, the tapping growing louder, more insistent. The figure remained still, as if waiting for me to approach. I stopped a few feet away, my hand trembling as I raised the light to illuminate the figure. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was a girl no older than 15, dressed in a tattered Hollow Creek High cheerleading uniform. Her hair was matted, her skin pale, and her eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. She smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that sent a wave of terror through me. The tapping stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I tried to speak, to ask who she was, but the words caught in my throat. She took a step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone as I tried to put distance between us. But she kept coming, her black eyes locked onto mine, that horrific smile never wavering. I turned and ran, bolting out of the gym and back down the hall. The laughter returned, echoing around me, growing louder and more maniacal with each step. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. I didn't go back inside that night. I couldn't. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. The next day I called in sick, to shaken to face the school, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. On Monday, I returned to Hollow Creek High, determined to put the experience behind me. But the moment I stepped into the building, the memories came flooding back, filling me with dread. The students noticed my change in demeanor, and a few even asked if I was okay. I forced a smile, telling them I was fine, just a little under the weather. But I wasn't fine. I couldn't focus, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then the rumors started again. Students began to whisper about strange noises coming from the old gym, about shadows moving in the hallways, about a girl in a cheerleading uniform who would appear and disappear without a trace. The stories spread like wildfire, and soon the entire school was abuzz with talk of the haunting. I tried to dismiss it as typical teenage gossip, but I couldn't ignore the fear in their eyes the way they avoided certain parts of the school. I knew they were telling the truth. I had seen her, too. I started to dig into the school's history, searching for any information that could explain what I had encountered. What I found only deepened the mystery. Hollow Creek High had been built in the 1950s, and for the first few decades, it was a normal, uneventful school. But in the early 1980s, things began to change. Students started to disappear, vanishing without a trace. The first was a sophomore named Emily Cooper, a cheerleader who was last seen in the old gym. She was reported missing, but no trace of her was ever found. Over the next few years, more students went missing, all of them last seen near or inside the gym. The disappearances stopped after the gym was closed down due to structural issues, but the rumors persisted. Some said the gym was cursed, that it was built on an old burial ground, or that a vengeful spirit had taken up residence there, but no one knew for sure. I tried to put the pieces together, but the more I learned, the more questions I had. What had happened to Emily Cooper? Why had the disappearances stopped after the gym was closed? And, most importantly, what was haunting Hollow Creek High? I continued to work at the school, but I never stayed late again. I avoided the old gym at all costs, and I made sure to always be around other people. But the fear never left me. It lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of what I had seen. The students continued to talk, the stories growing more outlandish with each retelling. Some claimed to have seen the girl in the bathroom mirrors. Others said they heard her crying in the halls late at night. I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that something was wrong with Hollow Creek High, something that couldn't be explained or understood. I thought about quitting, about leaving the town and never looking back, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I felt a strange connection to the school, a sense of duty to protect the students from whatever was haunting it. And so I stayed, even as the fear gnawed at me, even as the nightmares plagued my sleep. I stayed because I knew that if I left, I would never find out the truth, and I needed to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. It's been a year since that night in the gym, and I've learned to live with the fear, but it's always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my classroom, I hear the faint sound of laughter echoing through the halls, and in those moments I remember the girl in the gym, her black eyes and twisted smile, and I know that she's still here, watching, waiting. I don't know what she wants, and I don't think I ever will. But I do know one thing: Hollow Creek High is not just a school. It's a place where the past and the present collide, where the living and the dead exist side by side. And as long as I'm here, I'll never be alone. My name is Rima, and I've always considered myself a rational person, never one to believe in superstitions or old wives' tales. But what happened to me a few years ago shattered my skepticism and left me with a deep respect for the unknown forces that lurk just beneath the surface of our reality. I was born and raised in Jaipur, a city rich with history, culture, and stories of ancient curses. My family was one of those old aristocratic ones with a sprawling haveli that had been passed down through generations. Growing up, I would often hear stories from my grandparents about our ancestors and the treasures they had accumulated over centuries. One such treasure was an ornate gold necklace studded with rubies and emeralds, said to have been crafted by a master jeweler for a Rajput queen. It was beautiful, no doubt, but it came with a warning. It was cursed. The curse was said to be the work of a vengeful sorceress spurned by the queen's family. The necklace, though stunning, was believed to bring misery and death to anyone who dared wear it. Of course, I never believed in such nonsense. To me, it was just another piece of family lore, exaggerated over the years, add a sense of mystery to our lineage. But all that changed the day I decided to wear the necklace to a wedding. It was my cousin's wedding, a grand affair that was the talk of the town. Everyone was expected to look their best, and I wanted to wear something that would set me apart from the crowd. I had seen the necklace many times, locked away in an old wooden chest in my grandmother's room. It was stunning, with intricate designs that caught the light and made the rubies and emeralds sparkle like fire. On a whim, I asked my grandmother if I could wear it to the wedding. She looked at me with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Rima, that necklace. It's not meant to be worn," she said, her voice hesitant. "It carries a curse, a terrible one. No one in our family has worn it for generations." I laughed it off, convinced that it was just a story meant to keep me from borrowing it. "Come on, Dottie. You don't really believe that, do you? It's just an old piece of jewelry. And besides, it's too beautiful to stay locked up in a chest forever." After some persuasion, she reluctantly agreed, but not without a final warning. "Wear it if you must, but be careful. The curse is real. Rima, don't take it lightly." I nodded, more to placate her than out of any real concern, and took the necklace to my room. I remember holding it in my hands, marveling at the craftsmanship, the weight of the gold, the way the gemstones seemed to pulse with an inner light. I felt a strange tingle as I fastened it around my neck, but I brushed it off as excitement. The wedding was beautiful, a lavish event with hundreds of guests, music, and food. I felt like a princess, the necklace drawing admiring glances and compliments from everyone I met. But as the night went on, I started to feel uneasy. It began as a slight discomfort in my chest, a tightness that made it hard to breathe. I assumed it was just nerves or the weight of the necklace, but the feeling grew stronger, more intense. By the time the wedding rituals were over, I was struggling to breathe, my vision blurring. I excused myself and rushed to the nearest bathroom, desperate to get some air. As I leaned against the sink, trying to steady myself, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, almost ghostly, and the necklace around my neck seemed to glow with a sinister light. I fumbled with the clasp, trying to remove it, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if the necklace had tightened around my throat, choking me. Panic set in. I pulled at it, desperate to get it off, but the more I struggled, the tighter it seemed to get. My vision darkened, and I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness. Just as I was about to black out, the bathroom door burst open, and my grandmother rushed in. She must have sensed something was wrong, for she had followed me from the wedding hall. Without a word, she grabbed the necklace and yanked it off with a force I didn't know she possessed. The moment it left my neck, I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. My grandmother cradled me in her arms, her face pale with fear. "I told you, Rima," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The curse is real. This necklace is not meant to be worn. It brings only death." I was too weak to respond, but her words echoed in my mind as I drifted in and out of consciousness. When I finally woke up, I was back in my room, the necklace nowhere in sight. My grandmother sat by my bed, her eyes red from crying. "I've locked it away again, where it belongs," she said quietly. "You're lucky to be alive, Rima. The curse could have taken you." I wanted to argue, to tell her that it was just a coincidence, that there was no such thing as a curse, but deep down I knew she was right. The feeling of that necklace tightening around my neck, the way it had seemed to pulse with malevolence, those were not the products of an overactive imagination. Over the next few days, I learned more about the history of the necklace. It had indeed been crafted for a Rajput queen, but the sorceress who cursed it had been wronged by the queen's family. The curse was her revenge, a dark magic that bound itself to the necklace, dooming anyone who wore it. My grandmother told me stories of others in our family who had tried to wear the necklace over the years. All of them had met tragic ends. Some died in mysterious accidents, others fell gravely ill, and a few simply disappeared, never to be seen again. I realized then that I had been spared, perhaps by sheer luck or my grandmother's timely intervention. But the experience left me shaken, and I vowed never to go near that necklace again. To this day, It remains locked away in that old chest, hidden from sight, a relic of a time when curses and dark magic were all too real. I've never spoken of the incident to anyone outside my family, but the memory haunts me. I still have nightmares where I'm wearing the necklace, and it tightens around my throat, choking the life out of me. Every time I wake up, gasping for air, I'm reminded of the curse and the dark forces that we can never fully understand or control. I've become more cautious since then, more respectful of the old stories and the warnings that come with them. I've learned that some things are better left untouched, some treasures better left hidden, because sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, and the curses of old have a way of finding their way back to the present. I took the job at Lockwood Warehouse out of sheer desperation. The pay was decent, the hours were nightmarish, but I needed the money. It wasn't my first choice, working the night shift in a cold, echoing warehouse, but it was a job. The warehouse itself was massive, a labyrinth of steel shelves stacked high with boxes and crates. The air was thick with dust, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly, casting eerie shadows across the concrete floor. But it wasn't the dust or the lights that unnerved me, it was the silence, the kind of silence that presses in on you, amplifying every creak, every distant clang of metal, every whisper of wind that somehow found its way inside. My first night on the job, the supervisor, a gruff man named Carl, gave me a quick rundown. Keep an eye on things, make sure no one breaks in, and don't wander too far, he said, his voice raw from years of smoking. He handed me a flashlight and a walkie-talkie, then left me alone in the dimly lit break room. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting down the hours until dawn. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the warehouse. The place was a maze, aisles and aisles of towering shelves filled with goods waiting to be shipped out. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rows of boxes and crates, but revealing nothing out of the ordinary. For the first couple of hours, everything was quiet. I patrolled the aisles, checked the doors, and tried to keep my mind from wandering. But as the night wore on, the silence began to feel oppressive, like a weight pressing down on me. It was around 2 a.m. when I first heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear over the hum of the fluorescent lights. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, coming from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. I followed the sound, my heart starting to race. The tapping grew louder as I approached the back of the warehouse, where the oldest, most disused shelves stood. These shelves were covered in dust, the boxes stacked haphazardly, some of them half open, their contents spilling out. The tapping stopped as I rounded a corner, and I found myself standing in front of a large, rusted metal door. The door led to an old storage area, a section of the warehouse that Carl had told me was off limits. Nothing back there but junk, he had said, waving off my questions. But now, standing in front of that door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar, the lock broken, and a faint, musty smell wafted out from the darkness beyond. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave the door alone and go back to my patrol. But curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The room beyond was pitch black, the air thick with dust and decay. I swept my flashlight around, revealing rows of old, rotting crates and broken furniture. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. I took a step inside, the floor creaking under my weight. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a moment before stabilizing. I took another step, and that's when I heard a soft, shuffling sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was coming from the far corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest. I strained my eyes, trying to make out what was there, but all I could see was darkness. My flashlight flickered again, and then it went out completely, plunging me into blackness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work. The shuffling sound grew louder, closer, and I could hear something breathing, a low, rasping sound that sent chills down my spine. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but my foot caught on something, and I stumbled, crashing to the floor. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Then, slowly, the breathing resumed, louder and more ragged, like whatever it was right next to me. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I frantically pressed the button on the flashlight. It flickered back to life, the beam weakened and steady, but it was enough to see what was in front of me. A figure stood in the darkness, tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, sunken pits, and its mouth hung open in a twisted, grotesque grin. It took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, barreling through the door and slamming it shut behind me. I could hear it on the other side, scratching at the door, its breathing growing more frantic. I didn't stop running until I was back in the break room, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't tell Carl what happened. I didn't tell anyone. But I didn't go back to that section of the warehouse either. I stuck to the main aisles, kept my head down, and tried to ignore the faint sounds that echoed through the warehouse at night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever was in that room hadn't forgotten about me. The days turned into weeks, and I tried to convince myself that it had all been in my head, a product of fatigue and an overactive imagination. But deep down I knew the truth. There was something in that warehouse, something that shouldn't be there, something that was waiting. I started to notice things, small things, at first. A box that had been moved, a door that was left open, a light that flickered for no reason. But then it escalated. I'd hear footsteps behind me, only to turn around and find nothing. I'd see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked, there was no one there. And always there was this sound of breathing, low and raspy, like something was just out of sight, watching, waiting. I tried to quit, but Carl wouldn't let me. "You're imagining things," he said, brushing off my concerns. "This place is old. It creaks and groans. There's nothing here." But I knew better. I started to dread the nights, counting down the hours until my shift ended. I stopped sleeping, my dreams filled with that twisted figure, its hollow eyes staring into mine. I became jumpy, paranoid, always looking over my shoulder. And then one night, it all came to a head. It was a Friday, the end of a long, exhausting week. I was doing my rounds, flashlight in hand, when I heard it again, the tapping. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was echoing through the entire warehouse. I tried to ignore it, to keep walking, but it followed me, getting closer and closer. I broke into a run, my heart racing. But no matter where I went, the sound was there, right behind me. I reached the break room, slamming the door shut and locking it. The tapping stopped, replaced by that awful breathing, loud and rasping. coming from just outside the door. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the door, praying that it would hold. But then the doorknob began to turn slowly, deliberately. I grabbed a chair, wedging it under the doorknob, but the turning continued, relentless. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped, my breath coming out in invisible puffs. I could hear it on the other side, scratching at the door, the sound of its breathing filling the room. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I was trapped, alone, with that thing just on the other side of the door. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The breathing, the scratching, the turning of the doorknob, it all stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, but nothing happened. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door, pressing my ear against it. Listening, there was, louder and more ragged, like whatever it was right next to me. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I frantically pressed the button on the flashlight. It flickered back to life, the beam weakened and steady, but it was enough to see what was in front of me. A figure stood in the darkness, tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, sunken pits, and its mouth hung open in a twisted, grotesque grin. It took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, barreling through the door and slamming it shut behind me. I could hear it on the other side, scratching at the door, its breathing growing more frantic. I didn't stop running until I was back in the break room, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't tell Carl what happened. I didn't tell anyone. But I didn't go back to that section of the warehouse either. I stuck to the main aisles, kept my head down, and tried to ignore the faint sounds that echoed through the warehouse at night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever was in that room hadn't forgotten about me. The days turned into weeks, and I tried to convince myself that it had all been in my head, a product of fatigue and an overactive imagination. But deep down I knew the truth. There was something in that warehouse, something that shouldn't be there, something that was waiting. I started to notice things, small things, at first. A box that had been moved, a door that was left open, a light that flickered for no reason. But then it escalated. I'd hear footsteps behind me, only to turn around and find nothing. I'd see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked, there was no one there. And always there was this sound of breathing, low and raspy, like something was just out of sight, watching, waiting. I tried to quit, but Carl wouldn't let me. "You're imagining things," he said, brushing off my concerns. "This place is old. It creaks and groans. There's nothing here." But I knew better. I started to dread the nights, counting down the hours until my shift ended. I stopped sleeping, my dreams filled with that twisted figure, its hollow eyes staring into mine. I became jumpy, paranoid, always looking over my shoulder. And then one night, it all came to a head. It was a Friday, the end of a long, exhausting week. I was doing my rounds, flashlight in hand, when I heard it again, the tapping. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was echoing through the entire warehouse. I tried to ignore it, to keep walking, but it followed me, getting closer and closer. I broke into a run, my heart racing. But no matter where I went, the sound was there, right behind me. I reached the break room, slamming the door shut and locking it. The tapping stopped, replaced by that awful breathing, loud and rasping, coming from just outside the door. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the door, praying that it would hold. But then the doorknob began to turn slowly, deliberately. I grabbed a chair, wedging it under the doorknob, but the turning continued, relentless. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped, my breath coming out in invisible puffs. I could hear it on the other side, scratching at the door, the sound of its breathing filling the room. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I was trapped, alone, with that thing just on the other side of the door. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The breathing, the scratching, the turning of the doorknob, it all stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, but nothing happened. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door, pressing my ear against it. Listening, there was. My name is Vikram, and I've always had a love for the outdoors. Growing up in the mountains of Himachal Pradesh, I was surrounded by nature's beauty, and hiking became a part of who I was. I would often go on long treks, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, exploring the hidden trails and untouched forests that dotted the region. But there was one hike that I wish I had never embarked upon, a journey that nearly cost me my life and left me scarred in ways I can never fully heal. It was early autumn, the air crisp, and the trees beginning to don their golden hues. A group of my closest friends had come up with the idea of tackling one of the more challenging trails in the region, a path that led to an old, abandoned village nestled deep within the mountains. The village, known as Kuldhara, was shrouded in mystery and legend. It was said to have been abandoned overnight by its inhabitants, who left behind only whispers of a curse that had befallen them. The stories were chilling, but we were young, eager, and full of bravado. We saw it as an adventure, a chance to test our limits and maybe, just maybe, uncover the truth behind the legends. There were 5 of us in total: me, Rajat, Sunil, Priya, and Naya. We had all grown up together, our bond forged in the fires of childhood and adolescence. We trusted each other implicitly and had tackled countless hikes together. This one, we believed, would be no different. We set out early one morning, our backpacks loaded with supplies and our spirits high. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful, the trail well-marked, and the scenery breathtaking. The mountains stretched out before us, a canvas of green and gold, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and earth. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, the trail became less defined, the trees thicker, and the light dimmer. The atmosphere began to change, a subtle shift that we initially ignored. The bird song that had accompanied us fell silent, replaced by the eerie sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I remember looking around, noticing how the landscape seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. The trees loomed larger, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes, casting long, spindly shadows across the path. It was as if the forest itself was trying to warn us, urging us to turn back. But we pressed on, determined to reach the village before nightfall. As the day wore on, the trail became increasingly difficult to follow. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and roots that seemed to reach out, trying to trip us up. The air grew colder, a biting chill that seeped into our bones despite the layers of clothing we wore. By late afternoon, we realized we were lost. The trail had all but disappeared, and the dense undergrowth made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Rajat, the most experienced among us, tried to keep us calm, insisting that we could find our way back if we retraced our steps. But as we turned around, we were met with an unsettling sight. The forest behind us had changed. The path we had walked just moments before was now unrecognizable, the trees and rocks rearranged in a way that made no sense. It was as if the forest itself had shifted, closing in around us, trapping us in its grasp. Panic began to set in. We argued, our voices rising in fear and frustration. Sunil suggested we split up to cover more ground, but the idea was quickly shot down. We knew the dangers of separating in the wilderness, especially in an area as remote and unfamiliar as this. As the light began to fade, we made the decision to set up camp and wait for morning. We found a small clearing, the only space large enough to accommodate our tents. But even as we worked to pitch them, the sense of unease grew stronger. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees looming like silent sentinels, watching our every move. That night we huddled together, our campfire the only source of warmth and light. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. None of us spoke much, each lost in our own thoughts, our bravado from earlier in the day replaced by a gnawing fear. As the night wore on, sleep eluded me. I lay in my tent, staring up at the fabric ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every creak, every rustle seemed magnified, my senses heightened by the darkness and the unknown. It was then that I heard a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I froze, my heart racing. I strained to hear, trying to convince myself that it was just an animal, but the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. I could hear the others stirring in their tents, their fear palpable. I slowly unzipped my tent and peered out into the night. The fire had died down, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing, and that's when I saw them figures, dark and indistinct, moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. They were tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs and twisted, unnatural forms. They moved with a strange, jerky motion, as if their joints bent in ways they shouldn't. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to shout, to warn the others, but the words died in my mouth as one of the figures turned its head towards me. Its eyes were nothing but empty voids, black and soulless, and yet I felt them bore into me, filling me with a terror unlike anything I had ever known. I scrambled back into my tent, my mind racing. I could hear the others now, their whispers frantic as they had seen the figures. We knew we had to leave, but the night was thick with darkness, and the trail was impossible to find in the gloom. We decided to wait until dawn, hoping that the light would drive away whatever was out there. But as the night dragged on, the figures drew closer, their presence a constant, oppressive weight on our minds. The growling sound continued, reverberating through the clearing, growing louder, more menacing. I don't know how long we sat there, paralyzed by fear, but it felt like an eternity. The first light of dawn was a welcome sight, and we wasted no time packing up our gear, our hands trembling with the urgency to leave. The figures were gone, vanished with the night, but their presence lingered in the air, a dark, oppressive force that hung over us. We stumbled through the forest, our nerves frayed and our senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent us into a panic, but we pressed on, desperate to find our way out. It wasn't until we broke through the tree line and saw the familiar landmarks of our village in the distance that we finally allowed ourselves to breathe. We made it back, physically unscathed, but mentally shattered. We never spoke of what we saw that night, the horrors we encountered in that cursed forest. The experience changed us, each of us carrying the scars of that night in our own way. Some of us moved away, seeking solace in the anonymity of the city, while others, like me, stayed behind, haunted by the memories. I've never gone hiking since the mountains, once a source of joy and adventure, now hold only fear and sorrow for me. I've heard stories of others who have ventured into that same forest, only to disappear without a trace. Some say it's the spirits of the abandoned village, seeking revenge on those who dare disturb their eternal rest. Others believe it's something older, darker, a force that has existed in those mountains long before humans ever set foot there. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, the terror I felt, and the dark figures that still haunt my dreams. The forest took something from me that night, something I can never get back. And I've learned the hard way that some trails are meant to be left unexplored, some paths better left untrodden, because sometimes the darkness we seek to conquer is far more powerful than we could ever imagine. I was never one to believe in the supernatural, but what happened to me at Hollow Creek changed everything. I had just moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere, a place where everyone knew everyone and outsiders were met with a certain level of suspicion. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods. It seemed like the perfect place to start fresh, to escape the chaos of the city. I found a small house on the outskirts of town, near a creek that wound its way through the woods. The locals called it Hollow Creek, though I never understood why. The water was clear and cool, and the trees that lined its banks were tall and ancient, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was peaceful, or at least it seemed that way at first. My first few weeks in town were uneventful. I spent my days unpacking, getting to know the area, and trying to make friends with the locals. But there was something off about the people in Hollow Creek. They were friendly enough, but there was a wariness in their eyes, a guardedness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. They didn't like to talk about the town's history, and whenever I mentioned the creek, they would change the subject or make excuses to leave. It wasn't until I met a man named Tom that I started to learn the truth about Hollow Creek. Tom was older, with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of a hard life. He was one of the few people in town who didn't shy away from me, and we quickly became friends. One evening, after a few beers at the local bar, Tom started to open up. "You ever hear about the cult at Hollow Creek?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I shook my head, intrigued. "Cult? What cult?" Tom took a long drink from his beer, his eyes distant. "Happened a long time ago, before most folks around here were even born. But the story's been passed down generation to generation. Back in the 1800s, there was a group of people who lived in these woods. They kept to themselves, didn't interact with the town much. Folks called them a cult, said they worshipped something dark, something not of this world. I leaned in, my curiosity piqued. What happened to them?" Tom glanced around the bar, as if making sure no one was listening. "One night, the entire group disappeared. Every single one of them, gone without a trace. Some say they moved on, but others believe something took them, something from the creek." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, something from the creek?" Tom shook his head, his expression grim. "No one knows for sure. But people around here, they avoid that creek at night. They say you can hear them, the cult members, chanting in the woods. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you'll see them." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping over me. "Come on, Tom, that's just a story." But Tom didn't smile, he didn't laugh. He just looked at me with those haunted eyes and said, "Stay away from the creek, kid. Whatever you do, don't go there at night." I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured It was just a local legend, a ghost story meant to scare newcomers. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started having strange dreams of dark figures moving through the trees, of chanting voices that echoed in my mind long after I woke up. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the sound of the creek rushing in my ears. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just stress from the move, but the dreams only got worse. One night I woke up to the sound of whispering outside my window. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, straining to hear. The whispering was faint, like the wind rustling through the leaves, but it was there, unmistakable. I got out of bed and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was full, casting an eerie light over the landscape. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows long and twisted. And there, by the edge of the creek, I saw them figures, shrouded in darkness, moving silently through the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figures were tall, their movements slow and deliberate. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but I could feel their presence, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to look away, to close the curtains and hide, but I couldn't move. I was transfixed, my eyes locked on the figures as they moved closer to the creek, and then suddenly they stopped. All at once they turned to face my house, their heads snapping toward me in unison. I gasped, stumbling back from the window, my heart racing. I didn't know what they were, or what they wanted, but I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, not caring that it was the middle of the night. I jumped in my car and drove, not stopping until I was miles away from that cursed place. I never went back to Hollow Creek. I couldn't. Whatever was in those woods, whatever those figures were, I wanted no part of it. I tried to put it behind me, to move on with my life, but the memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear the sound of whispering, faint and distant, like the wind rustling through the trees, and I'll see them in the shadows, watching, waiting. I don't know what they are or what they want, but I do know one thing: I'll never go near Hollow Creek again. It was a chilly winter evening in Delhi, the kind where the fog hangs low and the streets are bathed in a ghostly pallor. My name is Shyam, and I had been working as a taxi driver for over a decade. I had seen it all, the good, the bad, and the downright strange, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to experience that night. It started like any other evening. I had just finished a late fare near Connaught Place and was heading back to the main road, hoping to catch a few more passengers before calling it a night. The roads were quieter than usual, the city wrapped in a blanket of silence that was only broken by the occasional honk of a distant car. As I drove down a particularly desolate stretch, my phone buzzed with a notification from the taxi app. A new ride request had come in, and it was close by. Without thinking twice, I accepted the fare and followed the map's directions. The pickup location was in a part of the city I rarely frequented, an old, dilapidated neighborhood that had long since lost its charm. The buildings were crumbling, their facades blackened with age, and the street lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the narrow streets. I pulled up to the designated address, a small, run-down house that looked like it had been abandoned years ago. The windows were dark, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. I checked the app again to make sure I was in the right place. It was then that I noticed something odd. The fare had no destination listed. This wasn't entirely unusual, as some passengers preferred to give their destination in person, but given the location and the hour, it gave me pause. Still, I had been in this line of work long enough to know that curiosity didn't pay the bills, so I waited. A few minutes passed, and just as I was about to cancel the ride and move on, the back door of my taxi opened. I jumped, startled by the sudden movement, and glanced in the rearview mirror. A woman had slipped into the back seat, her face obscured by the darkness. She was dressed in a simple sari, her hair neatly tied back, but there was something off about her. She was unusually still, her posture rigid, and she made no effort to acknowledge me or give a destination. "Good evening, madam," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where can I take you?" There was a long pause, during which she didn't move or speak. I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck, the hairs on my arms standing on end. Something wasn't right. Finally, in a soft, almost whispery voice, she said, "Take me to Yamuna Bridge." I nodded, though her choice of destination struck me as strange. The Yamuna Bridge was not a place anyone would willingly go to at this hour. It was notorious for its isolation, and there had been rumors of people jumping off the bridge, never to be seen again. I tried to push those thoughts aside as I put the car in gear and started driving. The silence in the car was unnerving. I tried to make small talk, as I often did with my passengers, but she remained silent, staring straight ahead. Every so often, I would steal a glance at her in the mirror, only to find her sitting as still as a statue, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The fog thickened as we neared the bridge, reducing visibility to just a few feet. The headlights of my taxi cut through the mist, casting long, ghostly beams that danced on the road. My heart began to race, a sense of dread creeping in as we drew closer to the bridge. The stories I had heard over the years played over and over in my mind, each one more horrifying than the last. When we finally reached the bridge, I pulled over to the side and stopped the car. The river below was shrouded in darkness, the water barely visible through the fog. "We're here, madam," I said, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. "Is this where you wanted to go?" For a moment, she said nothing, just sat there in the back seat, staring out the window. Then, in that same soft voice, she spoke again. "This is where it happened," she said, more to herself than to me. "This is where I died." My blood ran cold. I turned in my seat to look at her, but what I saw made my heart stop. The woman's face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow and sunken. Her once neat sari was now tattered and soaked, as if she had just emerged from the river. And then, as I watched in horror, she began to fade, her form becoming more and more transparent until there was nothing left but the empty seat. I sat there, frozen in shock, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just witnessed. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could barely breathe. It felt like I was in a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the spot where she had been. Eventually I forced myself to move, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel and drove away from the bridge as fast as I could. When I finally reached a more populated area, I pulled over and took a moment to gather myself. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what had just happened, but there was no explanation that made sense. I checked the back seat again, half expecting to see some trace of her, but there was nothing, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The fare was still active on the app, but when I tried to close it, I found that the passenger's details had vanished. There was no name, no number, no record of the ride. It was as if she had never existed. I drove back to the garage in a daze, my thoughts consumed by the night's events. I couldn't shake the image of her face, the emptiness in her eyes. I had heard stories from other drivers about strange passengers, ghostly encounters on the late-night shift, but I had never believed them. Now I wasn't so sure. For weeks I couldn't bring myself to drive at night. The fear that I might see her again, or worse, pick up another lost soul, was too much to bear. Even now, years later, the memory of that night haunts me. I still drive, but I avoid that stretch of road, and I never, ever accept rides that don't have a destination, because in this city, with its long history and countless secrets, you never know who or what might be waiting for a ride. It was supposed to be just another hunting trip. Every year a group of us would head out to Bitterroot Woods for a week of camping, hunting, and camaraderie. We'd been doing it for years, a tradition passed down from our fathers and their fathers before them. Bitterroot was dense, sprawling wilderness with miles of thick trees and underbrush, the perfect place to get away from the world. We knew those woods like the back of our hands, or so we thought. This time there were four of us, me, Dave, Rick, and Matt. We'd been friends since childhood, and there was no one else I'd rather have beside me in the wild. We arrived at our usual campsite late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip behind the tree line. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling our lungs as we set up camp. By nightfall, we had a fire going, our tents pitched, and were settling in for a night of storytelling and laughter. Everything was going as usual until the first night. We were sitting around the fire, passing around a bottle of whiskey, when Dave suddenly went quiet. He was staring into the woods, his face pale, the bottle frozen halfway to his lips. "Dave, you all right?" I asked, following his gaze. "Did you see that?" He whispered, his voice trembling. "See what?" He shook his head, blinking as if trying to clear his vision. I thought I saw something just beyond the firelight. Something big." We all looked in the direction he was pointing, but there was nothing there, just the dark, impenetrable wall of trees. We laughed it off, teasing Dave for getting spooked so easily, but the truth was, something about the way he had looked so genuinely scared left us all feeling uneasy. The next day, we ventured deeper into the woods, looking for a good spot to hunt. We split up into pairs, with Rick and Matt heading west while Dave and I went east. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife strangely absent. Even the birds seemed to have fallen silent, as if the entire woods were holding its breath. We walked for hours, seeing no signs of game, no tracks, nothing. It was as if the forest was completely devoid of life. The unease from the night before had only grown, a heavy, oppressive feeling that weighed down on us as we trudged through the underbrush. Around noon, we found ourselves at a small clearing. Dave was ahead of me, his rifle slung over his shoulder, when he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. I nearly walked right into him. "Dave, what is it?" I asked, but he didn't respond. He was staring at the ground, his face ashen. I followed his gaze and saw what had stopped him. There, in the soft earth, was a footprint, but it wasn't like any footprint I'd ever seen before. It was massive, easily twice the size of a human foot, with long, clawed toes that dug deep into the soil. The print was fresh, so fresh that I could see the dampness of the earth where it had been pressed down. "What the hell made that?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. Dave shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not something we want to run into." We quickly decided to head back to camp. The rest of the day passed in a blur, both of us on edge, jumping at every sound, every rustle of leaves. When we finally made it back, Rick and Matt were already there, their faces grim. They hadn't had any luck hunting either, and, like us, they'd felt something was off in the woods. That night, the sense of dread was palpable. We sat around the fire, but the usual banter and laughter were absent. We were all on edge, our eyes constantly darting to the darkness beyond the FRELIGHT. It was some time after midnight when we heard it howl. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deep, guttural, a sound that seemed to resonate through the very earth beneath us. It was close to close. We all froze, our eyes wide with fear. The howl came again, even closer this time. It was followed by a rustling in the trees, the sound of something massive moving through the underbrush. "Get your guns," Rick whispered, his voice shaking. We scrambled to grab our rifles, the fire suddenly feeling like a flimsy barrier against whatever was out there. The sounds were getting closer, the rustling turning into the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. And then it emerged from the trees. It was like nothing I had ever seen or even imagined. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, with a body covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed in the firelight, a sickly yellow that seemed to pierce through the darkness. It stood on 2 legs, like a man, but its face was something out of a nightmare, elongated, with a snout full of razor-sharp teeth and ears that were pointed and alert. For a moment, none of us moved. We were too shocked, too terrified to do anything but stare at the creature that loomed before us. It let out another howl, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of teeth that could tear through flesh with ease. "Shoot it," Matt screamed, breaking the spell. We all raised our rifles and fired. The sound of the shots echoed through the night, but the creature didn't flinch. It didn't even bleed. It just stood there, staring at us with those glowing eyes, as if our bullets were nothing more than annoying flies. Then it charged. It was fast, faster than anything that size should be. It was on us in seconds, its claws slashing through the air. I dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its swipe. I could hear the others shouting, their voices panicked, but I couldn't focus on anything other than staying alive. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I tried to reload my rifle. The creature was still there, moving through the camp with terrifying speed and precision. It was toying with us, I realized, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse. I finally managed to reload and fired again, aiming for its head. The shot hit, and for a brief moment I thought I had finally done some damage. But then the creature turned toward me, its eyes narrowing, and I knew it was over. It lunged at me, its claws outstretched. I braced myself, knowing there was no way I could outrun it. But just as it was about to reach me, a deafening roar filled the air. The creature stopped in its tracks, its ears twitching. It looked around, confused, before letting out a growl and retreating back into the woods. We all stood there, stunned, as the sound of its footsteps faded into the distance. For a long time, none of us moved. We were too shocked, too scared to do anything but stare at the spot where the creature had disappeared. Eventually, Rick broke the silence. "Let's get the hell out of here." We didn't argue. We packed up what we could and left, not caring that it was the middle of the night. We drove straight back to town, none of us saying a word the entire way. I never went back to Bitterroot Woods. None of us did. Whatever was out there, whatever that creature was, it wasn't something that could be hunted or killed. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. I tried to forget about it, to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, but the memory of those glowing eyes, of those claws inches from my face, still haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a howl in the distance, and I'll remember that night in the woods, the night we came face to face with the dogman, and I'll wonder if it's still out there, waiting, watching, hunting. I had been a trucker for nearly 15 years, driving countless miles across the vast stretches of America's highways. The road had become my second home, a place where I found solitude and purpose. My name is Jake, and I prided myself on being one of the best in the business, always delivering my loads on time, no matter the conditions. But nothing could have prepared me for the night that changed everything, the night I wished I could forget. It was late November, and I was hauling a load of timber from Oregon to a small town in northern Idaho. The weather had been unforgiving all day, with relentless rain and gusts of wind that threatened to push my rig off the road. By the time night fell, the storm had intensified, and the highway was nearly deserted. Most drivers had pulled over to wait it out, but I was on a tight schedule and couldn't afford any delays. The route took me through a remote section of highway, winding through dense forests and mountainous terrain, the kind of place where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul. The darkness was thick, the rain hammering against the windshield, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the storm. I had just passed a small, forgotten town, one of those places that seemed frozen in time, with boarded-up storefronts and empty streets. The road ahead was pitch black, with no street lights or signs of life. The storm was relentless, and I had to keep a tight grip on the wheel to keep the truck steady. My mind was focused on the road, the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers, and the roar of the engine providing a sense of familiarity amidst the chaos. But then, out of nowhere, my radio crackled to life, a burst of static that made me jump in my seat. I hadn't touched the dial, and I knew I was far out of range of any station. The static persisted for a few seconds, then faded into silence. I tried to shrug it off, blaming it on the storm, but something about it didn't sit right with me. A few minutes later, the radio crackled again, this time with a faint, garbled voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at the radio, then back at the road, my heart starting to race. I had driven this route before, and I knew there were no stations that would reach this far into the wilderness. The voice came again, clearer this time, though I still couldn't understand it. It sounded distant, almost as if it were coming from another world. I turned the volume down, trying to focus on the road, but the unease was growing. The storm had worsened, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The wind howled, rattling the windows of the cab, and the rain pounded against the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. My nerves were on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I was about to reach for the radio to turn it off completely, and I saw something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the wet pavement as I fought to bring it to a stop. The tires screeched, and the trailer swung out slightly, but I managed to avoid hitting whatever or whoever it was. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared out into the rain-soaked night. The figure was still there, illuminated by the headlights. It was a man, standing motionless in the middle of the highway, wearing what looked like an old, tattered coat. His head was bowed, and I couldn't see his face. I leaned forward, squinting through the rain, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the storm. The man didn't respond, didn't move. He just stood there, like a statue, as if he were waiting for something. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something about him wasn't right. The way he was standing, the way he seemed completely unaffected by the storm, it was unnatural. I reached for the door handle, hesitating for a moment before opening it. The wind hit me like a wall as I stepped out of the cab, the rain instantly soaking through my clothes. I walked slowly toward the figure, my boots splashing in the puddles that had formed on the road. "Sir?" "Do you need help?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But still there was no response. As I got closer, I began to see more details. His coat was not just old, it was ancient, frayed at the edges and covered in dirt and grime. His hands hung limply at his sides, pale and weathered, like those of a man who'd spent years working in the harshest conditions. And then, as I was just a few feet away, he slowly lifted his head. I froze. His face was gaunt, his skin gray and lifeless, like a corpse that had been left out in the elements for far too long. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring straight through me. A wave of terror washed over me, and I took a step back, my mind reeling with disbelief. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the storm. But then he spoke, his voice low and raspy, barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a jolt of fear through me, and I turned to run back to the truck. But as I did, I noticed something even more terrifying. The man was no longer standing in front of me. He was gone, vanished into thin air. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted back to the cab, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to start. I didn't look back as I floored the accelerator, the truck lurching forward as I sped down the highway. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had to get out of there, had to put as much distance between myself and that stretch of road as possible. But the further I drove, the more the fear grew. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the storm relentless, and the radio still crackling with that eerie static. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing there, following me, but there was nothing, just the darkness and the rain. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours, and the storm finally began to let up. The rain eased to a drizzle, and the wind died down, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed, but I didn't dare stop until I reached a truck stop on the outskirts of a small town. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still shaking as I killed the engine. I sat there for a moment, trying to collect myself, my mind still reeling from the encounter. But as I reached for the door handle, something caught my eye. The passenger's seat, where my bag had been sitting, was empty. My bag was gone, and in its place was something that made my blood run cold. A small, weathered coat, soaked with rain and covered in dirt, just like the one the man had been wearing. I stared at it, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. How had it gotten there? Had I imagined the whole thing? But as much as I wanted to believe that, deep down I knew the truth. I had seen something that night, something that defied explanation. I didn't touch the coat. I didn't even look at it for long. I grabbed my keys, locked the truck, and walked into the truck stop, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the night in the truck stop's diner, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream. But the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, as the sun rose, I finally mustered the courage to go back to the truck. The coat was still there, a grim reminder of the night before. I didn't know what to do with it, so I left it where it was, hoping that if I ignored it, it would somehow disappear. I completed my delivery that day, but I was never the same. The open road, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt like a place of danger, filled with unseen threats and unspeakable horrors. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that the man in the coat was still out there, waiting for me on some lonely stretch of highway. Eventually, I left the trucking business altogether. The fear was too much, the memories too haunting. I took a job closer to home, far from the highways and the storms that had once been my life. But even now, years later, I can't drive at night without thinking about that encounter. I can't hear the crackle of a radio without remembering the static that filled my cab. And I'll never forget the man in the coat, the man who shouldn't have been there. I've always been an outdoor enthusiast. Hiking, camping, fishing, anything that got me into the wilderness was a welcome escape from the monotony of daily life. There's something about the solitude of nature that's both peaceful and invigorating, like a reset button for the soul. My name is Ryan, and this story takes place in the fall of 2018, when I decided to take a solo hiking trip into the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. I'd hiked those mountains before, but never alone. It was something I'd wanted to do for a while, to test my skills and push myself a little further than usual. The Bitterroots are known for their rugged beauty, with miles of dense forest, rocky peaks, and crystal-clear streams. But they're also remote, with vast areas that are seldom traveled, making it easy to get lost if you're not careful. I had planned a 3-day trek along a lesser-known trail that wound through the northern part of the range, far from the more popular routes. I was excited to disconnect from the world and immerse myself in the wild. The first day went smoothly. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp with the scent of pine in the air. The trail was challenging but manageable, and I made good time, reaching a small clearing by late afternoon where I decided to set up camp. I pitched my tent near a stream, the soothing sound of running water lulling me into a sense of calm as I cooked dinner over a small fire. As night fell, I sat by the fire, staring up at the stars that dotted the clear sky, feeling a deep sense of contentment. This was what I had come for: solitude, peace, and the beauty of the wilderness. But that night something happened that shattered that peace and turned my solo adventure into a nightmare. It was well past midnight when I first heard it, a low, distant sound that echoed through the trees. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to listen. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote or a wolf, but the sound wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It was rhythmic, almost like a chant, carried on the wind from somewhere deep in the forest. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my ears, but the more I listened, the more certain I became that it was something else, something unnatural. My heart started to race, and I felt a growing unease that I couldn't shake. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow over the campsite. The sound was still there, a haunting melody that seemed to rise and fall with the breeze. I swept the flashlight beam across the trees, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the dense forest and the dark shapes of the trees swaying in the wind. I told myself to calm down, that it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere, with no one to talk to and nothing to do but listen to the sounds of the night. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I crawled back into the tent, trying to block out the sound, but sleep was impossible. I lay there for hours, listening to that eerie chant, my mind racing with thoughts of what it could be. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I had made up my mind to pack up and move on. Whatever was making that sound, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I broke camp quickly, eager to put some distance between myself and whatever was out there. The trail ahead was steep and treacherous, but I pushed myself hard, trying to shake the unease that clung to me like a shadow. The sound had stopped as the sun rose, but the memory of it lingered, gnawing at my nerves. As the day wore on, I began to feel little better, the rational part of my mind telling me that it was just a natural phenomenon, nothing more. But then, as the afternoon light began to fade, I came across something that made my blood run cold. The trail led me to a small clearing, much like the one where I had camped the night before, but this clearing was different. In the center of it was a large, ancient tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled, with thick roots that spread out across the ground like the tentacles of some massive creature. At the base of the tree was a pile of stones, arranged in a rough circle, and in the middle of that circle was a small, weathered wooden box. My curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the box cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. It looked old, really old, with strange symbols carved into the wood. I reached out to touch it, but stopped myself, a sense of dread washing over me. Something about the box felt wrong, like it didn't belong there, like it was a part of something ancient and malevolent. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to leave it alone, to get as far away from it as possible. But before I could move, I heard the sound again, the same haunting chant from the night before, but this time it was louder, closer, as if it were coming from all around me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there, just the same empty forest, now filled with that terrifying sound. I was frozen with fear, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But then the chanting stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that was somehow even worse. And in that silence, I heard something else, a faint rustling, like the sound of leaves being crushed underfoot. I turned back toward the box, and that's when I saw it. The lid of the box was slowly opening, creaking on its rusted hinges. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there and watch. But I couldn't move, couldn't take my eyes off the box as the lid lifted higher and higher, revealing the darkness inside. For a moment, nothing happened. The box just sat there, open, with nothing inside but shadows. But then, out of that darkness, something began to emerge. A shape, indistinct at first, but slowly becoming more defined. It was a hand, a withered, skeletal hand, reaching out of the box as if trying to pull itself free. I finally found the strength to move, stumbling backward in horror, but I tripped over a root and fell to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, but it was too late. The hand was followed by an arm, then a shoulder, as something dragged itself out of the box and into the clearing. It was like a nightmare come to life, a creature of bone and rotting flesh with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I ran as fast as I could, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away from that thing. The forest closed in around me, the trees a blur as I sprinted down the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop, didn't look back, until I reached the edge of the forest and burst out onto a gravel road. I was miles from where I had started, exhausted and terrified, but I didn't care. I kept running until I reached a small town at the base of the mountains. I never went back to the Bitterroots. I couldn't. The memory of that night, of the sound and the box and the creature that came out of it, was burned into my mind. I told myself it was just a hallucination, a trick of the light and the wind, but deep down I knew better. Something was out there, something ancient and evil, and I had stumbled right into its domain. The worst part is, I still hear that sound sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, that same haunting chant echoing through the trees. And every time I hear it, I wonder if it's calling me back, if it's waiting for me to return to Bitterroot Creek. But I never will. I've learned my lesson. Some places are better left unexplored, some mysteries better left unsolved, and some curses are better left buried deep in the woods where they belong.